Hey guys, tonight we begin with the most devastating civil war in the history of Westeros, the Dance of Dragons. A conflict so brutal, so consuming, that it would see brother fight sister, dragon devour dragon, and the very foundations of House Targaryen crumble beneath the weight of their own ambition. From the burning skies above King's Landing to the cursed waters of the God's Eye, this is the story of how the mightiest dynasty in the known world nearly destroyed itself in pursuit of a throne made of melted swords. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Listen closely to these final words, spoken in the dying moments of Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen, as she faced her half-brother's dragon, knowing death was upon her. "You have already won, Aegon. Why do you torment me so?" But Aegon II, broken and bitter from years of war, gave no answer, and in that silence, in that moment of terrible recognition, lay the truth that neither sibling had understood until it was far too late. The Iron Throne they had both bled for, killed for, sacrificed everything for, had never been worth the price they paid. But how did it come to this? How did the children of King Viserys, once a loving family, become mortal enemies willing to burn the realm to ash? How did the dragons, those magnificent beasts that had conquered the Seven Kingdoms, become instruments of their own destruction? And why did a war that began with questions of birthright and legitimacy end with the near extinction of the very bloodline it was fought to preserve? The answers lie buried in 20 years of growing resentment, political manipulation, and the fundamental flaw in Targaryen nature. The same fire that made them conquerors also made them destroyers. The same blood that gave them dragons also gave them madness. And the same throne that elevated them above all other houses would ultimately demand a price in blood that even gods would hesitate to pay. Tonight we uncover the complete timeline of the Dance of Dragons. Every betrayal, every battle, every moment that led the realm from peace to devastation. This is not just the story of a succession war. This is the story of how power corrupts absolutely, how family bonds can become chains of hatred, and how the pursuit of destiny can become the architect of doom. The dance is about to begin. And by its end, the dragons will never be the same. In the year 129 after Aegon's conquest, the Iron Throne sat at the heart of an empire that stretched from the Wall in the north to the Summer Sea in the south. King's Landing bustled with nearly 500,000 souls, its streets filled with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, septons preaching salvation, and the ever-present rumble of carts carrying goods from every corner of the known world. The Red Keep towered above it all, its walls of pale red stone catching the morning light like dried blood, while deep beneath the city, in the ancient dragon pit, 17 dragons roosted in chambers carved from living rock. This was the height of Targaryen power. Never before, and never again, would so many dragons exist in the world. From the massive Vhagar, ancient beyond measure, and large enough to swallow a horse whole, to the newly hatched dragonlings, barely larger than hunting hounds, the Targaryen bloodline commanded the skies with absolute authority. Their silver-gold hair and violet eyes marked them as different from other men, touched by the old gods of Valyria, inheritors of fire and blood. Yet for all their power, for all their dragons, the Targaryens remained human, and humans, as history teaches us, are capable of both great love and terrible hatred, often toward the same people. The Red Keep itself told this story in stone and timber. Built by Maga the Cruel and expanded by every king since, it was a maze of towers, halls, and hidden passages, where whispers carried further than shouts and secrets grew like weeds in dark corners. The throne room, with its towering ceiling and narrow windows, centered around the Iron Throne itself, that jagged seat of twisted metal forged from the swords of defeated enemies. 1,000 blades, the stories claimed, melted by dragon fire and shaped into something that looked more like a wound than a chair. The throne had a will of its own, the courtiers whispered. It cut those unworthy to sit upon it, drawing blood from the undeserving. King Viserys I had learned this truth over his 26-year reign, each cut a reminder that even dragons were not immune to the throne's judgment. Beyond the capital, the realm stretched vast and diverse. Dragonstone, the ancient seat of House Targaryen, rose from the narrow sea like a mountain of black glass and flowing stone, its walls carved into the shapes of dragons, so lifelike they seemed ready to take flight. Here, in chambers warmed by volcanic vents, dragon eggs incubated, and Targaryen children learned the ancient ways of old Valyria. The castle's very stones remembered the doom, and those sensitive to such things claimed they could hear the screams of a dying civilization in the wind that howled through its towers. To the west, Casterly Rock commanded the sunset shore, its golden walls reflecting the wealth of House Lannister, while in the east, the ancient fortress of Storm's End defied both time and tempest with walls so thick that no siege engine had ever breached them. The north stretched cold and eternal beyond the neck, ruled from Winterfell by the Starks, who remembered oaths sworn in the darkness before dawn and held to them with the stubbornness of winter itself. Each of these great houses commanded thousands of sworn swords, controlled vast territories, and possessed wealth accumulated over centuries. Yet none could stand against dragons. This was the foundation of Targaryen rule. Not love or loyalty, but the simple truth that resistance meant death from above. The dragons were their legitimacy, their police force, their ultimate argument in any dispute. But power built on fear alone is always fragile, and by 129 AC, cracks had begun to show in the Targaryen dynasty. The old customs of Valyria, where brother married sister and blood purity mattered above all else, sat uneasily with the traditions of Westeros, where the eldest son inherited and women ruled only in the absence of male heirs. The faith of the Seven preached against the Targaryen practice of incestuous marriage, while the noble houses grew restless under the weight of dragon lords who saw themselves as living gods. Into this world of marble and malice, of ancient power and growing discontent, we must place our story. You are the chronicler, the seeker of truth in a realm built on lies and half-truths. Your task is to unravel the web of events that led to the greatest catastrophe in Targaryen history, to understand how a family that once conquered 7 kingdoms came so close to destroying itself completely. The players are taking their positions. In the Red Keep, an aging king struggles to hold his family together while powerful lords scheme in the shadows. On Dragonstone, a princess believes herself the rightful heir, while in the High Tower, a queen prepares to secure her children's future at any cost. Each believes their cause is just. Each believes they serve the greater good. Each is willing to pay any price for victory. None of them understand the true cost of the game they are about to play. The stage is set. The pieces are in motion, and in the distance, if you listen carefully, you can hear the first whispers of war. King Viserys Targaryen was never meant to wear the crown. Born as a second son in 77 AC, he spent his youth in the shadow of his elder brother Daemon, who possessed all the qualities expected of a Targaryen prince. Daemon was bold where Viserys was cautious, decisive where Viserys deliberated, and utterly ruthless where Viserys sought compromise. Yet when their grandfather Jaehaerys I finally passed in 103 AC, it was gentle Viserys who ascended the Iron Throne, chosen by the Great Council over Princess Rhaenys, the daughter of the late Prince Aemon. This decision would echo through the decades that followed. The lords of Westeros had faced a choice between the direct male line and the stronger claim through primogeniture. They chose tradition over law, male over female, and in doing so established a precedent that would later tear the realm apart. Rhaenys accepted their decision with grace, earning herself the title, the Queen Who Never Was, but the slight was not forgotten by House Targaryen or those who supported her claim. Viserys began his reign, determined to heal the wounds left by this contentious succession. Unlike his predecessors, he sought peace over conquest, diplomacy over intimidation. His dragon Balerion, the legendary Black Dread, who had carried Aegon the Conqueror to victory, died in 94 AC, and Viserys never claimed another. This symbolic gesture spoke volumes about the kind of king he intended to be. Where other Targaryens ruled through fire and blood, Viserys would rule through wisdom and restraint. His marriage to Queen Aemma Arryn seemed to promise the stability the realm craved. Aemma was everything a queen should be, beautiful, intelligent, and descended from both Targaryen and Arryn blood through her mother. The union between the dragon and the falcon represented a perfect political alliance, binding the loyalty of the Vale to the Iron Throne, while strengthening the Targaryen bloodline with fresh nobility. Their daughter Rhaenyra was born in 97 AC, a child who embodied the best of both her parents. She possessed the silver-gold hair and violet eyes of old Valyria, combined with the quick wit and fierce independence of House Arryn. From her earliest years, she displayed a natural affinity for dragons that amazed even the most experienced dragon keepers. Her bond with Syrax, a magnificent golden dragon, developed when both were young, creating a partnership that would define much of her later life. But despite this blessing, Viserys faced the fundamental challenge that had plagued Targaryen kings since the conquest. The realm expected a male heir. Sons carried the family name, inherited titles, and commanded armies. Daughters, no matter how capable, were seen as temporary holders of power until marriage transferred their authority to their husbands. This ancient prejudice ran deeper than law or custom, embedded in the very foundations of Westerosi society. Year after year, Queen Aemma suffered through pregnancies that ended in heartbreak. Miscarriages, stillbirths, and infants who died within days of birth marked the royal couple's desperate attempts to produce a son. Each loss took its toll on the gentle queen, weakening her body and spirit while placing enormous pressure on their marriage. The court whispered about curses, about the price of Targaryen inbreeding, about divine judgment on a family that defied natural law. The final tragedy came in 105 AC during what should have been a moment of triumph. Queen Aemma went into labor, with what the Maesters assured would be a healthy son. The entire realm held its breath, waiting for news of a prince who would secure the succession and end decades of uncertainty. Instead, the birth became a nightmare that haunted Viserys for the rest of his life. Faced with the choice between saving his wife or the child she carried, Viserys made the decision that would define his reign. He authorized the Maesters to cut the babe from Aemma's womb, sacrificing his beloved queen for the possibility of a male heir. The procedure, brutal and primitive by any standard, succeeded in delivering Prince Balon alive, but the infant survived only a day before joining his mother in death. The double funeral that followed became a moment of profound grief for the entire kingdom. Aemma had been genuinely beloved by the people, known for her charity and gentleness, while the lost prince represented the future stability of the realm. Viserys, overcome by guilt and sorrow, aged years in the span of weeks. The decision that cost him his wife and son would influence every choice he made thereafter, driving him toward an increasingly desperate need to preserve his remaining family at any cost. In the aftermath of this tragedy, Viserys made the most consequential decision of his reign. Rather than remarry immediately and attempt to produce another heir, he named Princess Rhaenyra his successor, making her the first formally acknowledged female heir to the Iron Throne since the conquest. The ceremony took place in the throne room, before hundreds of lords and ladies, with Rhaenyra kneeling before the Iron Throne as her father placed his hands upon her head. "I name Princess Rhaenyra of House Targaryen, my heir and successor," Viserys declared, his voice carrying throughout the hall. "She shall rule after me as Queen of the Andals, the Rhaenyra, and the First Men, and Lady of the Seven Kingdoms." One by one, the great lords of Westeros knelt before the teenage princess, swearing sacred oaths of fealty that bound them and their houses to her future reign. Lord Stark knelt first, followed by Lord Tully, Lord Baratheon, and dozens of others. Even Viserys's brother Daemon bent the knee, though those who knew him well noticed the slight smile that played across his lips as he did so. Yet even as the lords swore their oaths, many harbored private doubts. A queen regnant was unprecedented in Westerosi history, and the precedent set by the Great Council of 101 suggested that male claims would always supersede female ones. The faith of the Seven taught that women should be guided by their fathers and husbands, not rule in their own right. These concerns remained unspoken in the immediate aftermath of the ceremony, but they festered in private conversations and secret councils. The situation became infinitely more complicated when Viserys remarried in 106 AC. His choice of bride shocked the court and set in motion the events that would ultimately tear the realm apart. Rather than seeking a political alliance with a great house, Viserys chose Alicent Hightower, the 18-year-old daughter of his hand Otto Hightower. Alicent had served as Queen Aemma's companion in her final years, providing comfort and friendship during the Queen's long struggle with failed pregnancies. Beautiful, pious, and intelligent, she had caught the king's eye during his period of mourning, offering him solace in his darkest hours. Their courtship, conducted in the shadowy corridors of the Red Keep while the court still mourned the previous queen, scandalized many who felt Viserys was moving too quickly toward a new marriage. The wedding itself was a modest affair compared to the grand celebrations that typically marked royal unions. Viserys, still bearing the emotional scars of Aemma's death, wanted no elaborate ceremonies or extended festivities. He and Alicent exchanged vows in the royal sept before a small gathering of family and close advisors, with Princess Rhaenyra standing as witness to her father's new beginning. The birth of Prince Aegon in 107 AC changed everything. Suddenly, the realm had a male heir of undisputed legitimacy, born of the king's body and unquestionably Targaryen. The boy's arrival reignited all the old debates about succession, with many lords quietly wondering whether the king might reconsider his earlier decision to name Rhaenyra as his heir. More children followed in quick succession. Princess Rhaenyra arrived in 109 AC, followed by Prince Aemond in 110 AC, and finally Prince Daeron in 114 AC. Each birth strengthened the Hightower faction at court, while potentially weakening Rhaenyra's position as heir. Queen Alicent, once merely the Hand's daughter, now commanded respect as the mother of multiple royal children, including 2 healthy sons. The transformation of the court dynamics was subtle but profound. Otto Hightower, already one of the most powerful men in the kingdom as Hand of the King, now found his influence magnified through his daughter's position and his grandchildren's potential claims. The green banner of House Hightower began appearing more frequently in court ceremonies, while allies of the Hightowers received preferential treatment in appointments and honors. Yet Viserys refused to alter the succession, perhaps out of guilt over Aemma's death, or perhaps from a genuine belief that Rhaenyra deserved the throne she had been promised. This created a fundamental instability at the heart of the kingdom, where the named heir possessed a weaker claim than her younger half-brothers, at least according to traditional inheritance laws. The seeds of civil war had been planted in the soil of love, loss, and the impossible choices that crown kings. What began as a father's grief-stricken attempt to honor his daughter would grow into the most destructive conflict in Targaryen history. Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen entered womanhood, carrying the weight of unprecedented expectations. At 16, she possessed a beauty that court poets compared to Queen Alicent herself, with cascading silver hair that caught light like spun moonbeams and eyes the color of amethysts. But beneath this ethereal appearance lay a will forged from Valyrian steel and a pride that would brook no challenge to her birthright. Her contemporaries called her the realm's delight, a title that captured both her popularity among the common folk and her ability to charm even the most hardened lords. When she rode Syrinx above King's Landing, crowds would gather in the streets to watch their future queen command the skies. Her dragon, now fully grown and magnificent in her golden scales, had become as much a symbol of Rhaenyra's claim as the crown itself. Yet for all her public adoration, Rhaenyra struggled with the isolation that came with being heir to the Iron Throne. Female heirs were curiosities in Westeros, and she had no precedent to guide her path. The ladies of the court treated her with deference rather than friendship, while the lords oscillated between protective paternalism and barely concealed doubt about her fitness to rule. She found herself caught between the expectations of traditional femininity and the demands of royal authority, a balance that few understood and fewer still supported unconditionally. Her education reflected this unique position, where other noble daughters learned needlework and household management. Rhaenyra studied statecraft and military strategy. Masters tutored her in the histories of the Seven Kingdoms, teaching her the genealogies of great houses and the intricacies of trade agreements. She learned to read people as well as books, developing an acute understanding of court politics that would serve her well in the trials to come. The Dragon Pit became her sanctuary, the one place where her authority was unquestioned. Dragons recognized strength and will rather than gender, and Syrinx responded to Rhaenyra's commands with absolute loyalty. When they flew together, rider and mount moved as one entity, their bond transcending the petty concerns of earthbound politics. These flights above the capital served as both escape and preparation, reminding Rhaenyra that Targaryen power ultimately rested not on the approval of lords, but on the majesty of dragons. Her relationship with her stepmother Queen Alicent began cordially enough, with both women recognizing the need for harmony within the royal family. Alicent, only 9 years older than Rhaenyra, initially tried to serve as both friend and maternal figure to the princess. They shared meals, attended court functions together, and presented a united front in public appearances. This facade of family unity pleased King Viserys, who desperately wanted to believe that his new marriage had healed rather than complicated his household. But beneath this superficial harmony, fundamental tensions simmered. Alicent, raised in the faith of the Seven, struggled to accept Targaryen customs that her religion condemned as sinful. She viewed dragon riding with unease, seeing it as evidence of an unnatural bond between human and beast. More significantly, she harbored deep reservations about female rule, believing that the gods had ordained men to lead and women to support. These beliefs, instilled by her father Otto and reinforced by her religious education, made her an unlikely champion of Rhaenyra's cause. The birth of Prince Aegon II in 107 AC fundamentally altered this dynamic. Suddenly, Alicent was not just a queen, but the mother of a potential king, and her perspective shifted accordingly. She began to see Rhaenyra not as a beloved stepdaughter, but as an obstacle to her son's natural inheritance. This transformation was gradual, masked by continued courtesy and public displays of affection, but those closest to the court noticed the subtle changes in their interactions. Prince Aegon himself grew up in the shadow of these expectations, though he seemed remarkably unaware of or uninterested in the political implications of his birth. Where Rhaenyra embraced her destiny with fierce determination, Aegon appeared content to live as a royal spare, enjoying the privileges of his position without shouldering its responsibilities. He was charming when he chose to be, possessed of an easy smile and natural charisma that made him popular among the younger courtiers. His dragon, Sunfire, perfectly reflected his personality. Golden and beautiful, the dragon was magnificent to behold, but lacked the fierce intensity of Syrinx or the ancient wisdom of older beasts. When Aegon flew, it was for pleasure rather than purpose, delighting in aerial acrobatics and showing off for admiring crowds below. The contrast with Rhaenyra's purposeful flights could not have been more stark. The second generation of Queen Alicent's children brought their own complexities to the royal family dynamics. Princess Rhaenyra, born in 109 AC, displayed the dreamy temperament often associated with Targaryen gifts of foresight. She spoke in riddles that sometimes proved prophetic, spent hours studying insects and spiders, and seemed to inhabit a world partially removed from earthly concerns. Her dragon Dreamfire was an ancient beast who had once carried Queen Rhaenyra, adding historical weight to the young princess's already mystical presence. Prince Aemond, arriving in 110 AC, proved to be everything his elder brother was not. Where Aegon was careless, Aemond was disciplined. Where Aegon sought pleasure, Aemond pursued excellence. From his earliest years, he demonstrated a keen intelligence and fierce ambition that reminded many of Prince Daemon in his youth. The absence of a dragon egg in his cradle became a source of deep frustration for the boy, who watched his siblings command magnificent beasts while he remained earthbound. His eventual claiming of Vhagar in 120 AC would prove to be one of the most consequential events in Targaryen history. The ancient dragon, once ridden by Queen Visenya herself, was the largest and most powerful beast in the known world. For a 10-year-old boy to successfully bond with such a creature was unprecedented, marking Aemond as a dragon rider of exceptional ability. The claiming came at a terrible cost, however, as Prince Lucerys Strong slashed Aemond's eye with a blade during the chaotic aftermath, leaving him permanently scarred, but perhaps more dangerous than before. The youngest of Alicent's children, Prince Daeron, spent most of his childhood in Old Town as a ward of House Hightower. This arrangement, common among noble families seeking to strengthen political bonds, meant that he grew up largely separate from the court intrigues that shaped his siblings. His dragon Targaryen was known as the Blue Queen, a beautiful beast whose scales shimmered like sapphires in sunlight. Meanwhile, Rhaenyra's own path to motherhood proved controversial from the start. Her marriage to Seer Rhaenyra Velaryon in 114 AC was a political masterstroke that united the two most powerful dragon-riding houses in Westeros. The Velaryons brought their massive fleet and control of the Narrow Sea, while their own Targaryen blood through Princess Rhaenys made them natural allies for Rhaenyra's cause. Yet the marriage itself was complicated by Rhaenyra's obvious preference for male companionship, a reality that both families acknowledged privately while maintaining public pretenses. When Rhaenyra began producing children, whispers about their parentage followed immediately. Prince Jacaerys, born in 114 AC, bore little resemblance to his supposed father, instead displaying the dark hair and brown eyes of Sari Harwin Strong, the commander of the City Watch. The birth of Prince Lucerys in 115 AC and Prince Joffrey in 117 AC only intensified these rumors. All three boys shared the strong features, leading to cruel nicknames like the Strong Boys that followed them throughout their lives. Queen Alicent became one of the most vocal proponents of these whispers, seeing in them an opportunity to undermine Rhaenyra's legitimacy and strengthen her own children's claims. The question of the boys' parentage became a weapon in the growing Cold War between the two queens. Alicent's supporters pointed to their appearance as evidence of Rhaenyra's unfitness to rule, arguing that a princess who could not remain faithful to her marriage vows could hardly be trusted with the governance of a kingdom. Rhaenyra's faction countered that royal bloodlines had always been complex, and that the boys' legitimacy came from their mother's royal blood rather than their father's identity. This debate revealed deeper anxieties about female rule and sexual autonomy. Male kings had always maintained mistresses without significant political consequence, but a female heir faced different standards. The court expected her to embody both the authority necessary to rule and the purity that society demanded of women. These contradictory expectations created an impossible standard that Rhaenyra could never fully satisfy. The children themselves grew up aware of these tensions without fully understanding their implications. Jacaerys, as Rhaenyra's eldest son and heir, felt the pressure most acutely. He worked tirelessly to prove himself worthy of his inheritance, studying warfare and statecraft with an intensity that impressed even his detractors. His dragon, Vermax, grew alongside him, their bond strengthening as both matured toward adulthood. Lucerys, good-natured and less politically aware than his elder brother, seemed largely unburdened by questions of legitimacy. His dragon, Arrax, was young but showed promise, and Luke himself displayed the easy confidence that came from a sheltered upbringing in the royal court. The tragic irony of his eventual fate, dying in a conflict he neither started nor fully understood, would make him one of the war's most sympathetic victims. As these children grew toward adulthood, the battle lines of the coming conflict became increasingly clear. On one side stood Rhaenyra with her strong sons, supported by the Valyrians and their powerful fleet. On the other stood Queen Alicent with her children, backed by the Hightowers and their extensive network of allies throughout the Reach and beyond. King Viserys, caught between his love for his daughter and his affection for his younger children, refused to acknowledge the growing schism in his family. His determination to maintain peace at any cost ultimately ensured that the conflict would be far more devastating when it finally erupted. The seeds of war had taken root in the fertile ground of ambition, legitimacy, and the fundamental question of whether the Seven Kingdoms were ready for a queen. The decade of the 120s would prove to be the last peaceful years the Seven Kingdoms would know for generations. Yet beneath the surface tranquility, the Targaryen dynasty was slowly tearing itself apart through a series of seemingly small decisions that would have catastrophic consequences. Each choice, each slight, each moment of weakness or strength added another stone to the avalanche that would eventually bury the realm in fire and blood. The mysterious death of Ser Leno Valerian in 120 AC marked the beginning of the end for any hope of reconciliation between the rival factions. The official account spoke of a quarrel with a companion that turned violent, ending with Leno's death and his lover's flight across the narrow sea. But whispers in the shadowy corners of King's Landing told a different story, one that implicated Princess Rhaenyra and her uncle Daemon in a conspiracy to eliminate an inconvenient husband. The truth of what happened at Spicetown may never be fully known, but the consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Within days of Lenore's death, Rhaenyra and Daemon were wed in a secret ceremony on Dragonstone, conducted according to ancient Valyrian rites that predated the arrival of the Faith of the Seven in Westeros. The bride wore black and red, the colors of her house, while the groom's silver hair was bound with golden bands that caught the firelight like a crown. This marriage shocked even Rhaenyra's closest allies. Daemon Targaryen was many things: brilliant, charismatic, dangerous, but he was also a man of questionable loyalties and documented cruelties. His previous marriage to Lady Rhea Royce had ended with her mysterious death in a riding accident, and his brief marriage to Lyanna Velaryon had been marked by restless wandering across Essos. Many wondered whether Rhaenyra had chosen love over wisdom, or whether this union represented a calculated alliance between the two strongest dragons in the realm. Queen Alicent's reaction was swift and predictable. She declared the marriage an abomination before gods and men, citing both the speed of the union after Lyonor's death and the blood relationship between uncle and niece. The Faith of the Seven agreed, with the High Septon issuing a formal condemnation that questioned the legitimacy of any children born from such a union. This religious opposition provided a powerful weapon for Alicent's faction, allowing them to frame their opposition to Rhaenyra in moral rather than purely political terms. The birth of Prince Aegon the Younger in 120 AC and Prince Viserys in 122 AC gave Rhaenyra 2 more sons. But these children faced immediate questions about their legitimacy despite their obvious Targaryen features. The boys bore their father's silver hair and violet eyes, marking them unmistakably as dragons, yet their parents' controversial marriage provided ammunition for those who sought to undermine Rhaenyra's line. Daemon's return to court after years of exile brought a dangerous energy that King Viserys struggled to control. The king loved his brother despite their many quarrels, but he also feared Daemon's capacity for violence and his talent for turning minor disputes into major crises. Daemon's presence at Rhaenyra's side transformed her from a seemingly manageable threat to Alicent's children into a formidable power block capable of immediate and devastating action. The dragon Caraxes, Daemon's mount, embodied his rider's nature perfectly. Known as the bloodworm for his unusual red coloring, Caraxes was lean and serpentine, built for speed and aggression rather than the massive power of dragons like Vhagar or Balerion. When Daemon flew, it was with the predatory grace of a hunter seeking prey, and his presence in the skies above King's Landing served as a constant reminder of the violence that lurked beneath the surface of court politics. Meanwhile, the Hightower faction consolidated their own power base through careful placement of allies in key positions throughout the realm. Otto Hightower, restored as Hand of the King after a brief exile, used his influence to install supporters in crucial roles within the royal government. The City Watch, the Royal Treasury, and even the King's Guard gradually filled with men who owed their positions to Hightower patronage. The Greens, as they came to be known for their faction's chosen color, represented more than just another noble house seeking advancement. They embodied a particular vision of Westerosi society, one rooted in traditional values, religious orthodoxy, and established hierarchies. In their view, Rhaenyra's elevation represented a dangerous deviation from natural law that threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. The Blacks, Rhaenyra's supporters, countered with their own vision based on royal prerogative and the binding nature of sworn oaths. They argued that King Viserys had the absolute right to name his successor, and that the lords who had sworn fealty to Rhaenyra were honor-bound to support her claim regardless of personal preferences. This position attracted those who valued legal precedent over tradition, as well as houses that stood to benefit from a change in the established order. The children of both factions grew up in this atmosphere of barely concealed hostility, their relationships poisoned by adult ambitions and ancient grievances. What should have been normal sibling rivalries became training grounds for civil war, with each slight, each childhood quarrel, each moment of favoritism, adding to the accumulated resentment that would eventually explode into open conflict. The incident at Driftmark in 120 AC crystallized these tensions in the most tragic way possible. Following the funeral of Rhaenyra Velaryon, a nighttime altercation between the children ended with Prince Aemond losing an eye to Prince Lucerys' blade. The official account spoke of a quarrel over dragons, but the underlying cause was the accumulated weight of years of whispered insults and simmering hatred. King Viserys faced the impossible task of dispensing justice when both sides bore responsibility for the violence. Aemond had claimed the mighty Vhagar that very night, bonding with the ancient dragon in a display of courage that impressed even his enemies, but his taunts about the strong boy's legitimacy had escalated a children's fight into something far more serious. When Luke drew his blade in defense of his brother Jace, he permanently scarred the boy who would become one of the war's most dangerous commanders. The king's response satisfied no one. He refused to punish either child severely, instead calling for peace and forgiveness that neither side was prepared to offer. Queen Alicent's demand for Luke's eye in payment for Aemon's injury was rejected, but so were Rhaenyra's attempts to have Aemon punished for his accusations of bastardry. The compromise pleased neither faction and convinced both that the king was too weak to protect their interests. Aemon's transformation from that night forward was remarkable and terrifying. The loss of his eye, rather than diminishing him, seemed to concentrate his will and ambition into something far more dangerous than before. He wore his maiming as a badge of honor, covering the ruined socket with a sapphire that gleamed like a fallen star. His bond with Vhagar gave him command of the most powerful weapon in Westeros, and his hatred for his strong nephews became the driving force of his existence. The ripple effects of Driftmark extended far beyond the immediate participants. Houses throughout the realm watched the royal family's dysfunction with growing alarm, understanding that they would eventually be forced to choose sides in a conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable. The great lords began quietly assessing their military strength, reviewing their alliance networks, and preparing for a war that no one wanted but everyone expected. King Viserys' health began its final decline in the years following Driftmark, his body weakened by the stress of trying to hold together a family that seemed determined to destroy itself. The cuts from the Iron Throne, once minor annoyances, became infected wounds that refused to heal properly. Maesters whispered about curse and divine judgment, but the truth was simpler and more human. The king was literally being consumed by the impossible burden of his crown. His determination to avoid choosing between his daughter and his wife meant that he chose neither, leaving both factions to prepare for the succession struggle that would follow his death. The realm held its breath, waiting for the moment when the old king would finally succumb to his wounds and force the question that everyone had been avoiding for 20 years. Rhaenyra established her own court at Dragonstone, surrounding herself with advisors who shared her vision of female rule and Targaryen supremacy. The ancient fortress became a symbol of her legitimacy, its dragon-carved walls proclaiming her status as heir to Aegon the Conqueror. From its towers, she could see both King's Landing and the open ocean, representing the choice between engaging in court politics and fleeing to safety across the narrow sea. The final feast of 129 AC brought the entire family together one last time, a gathering that served more as a funeral for royal unity than a celebration of familial bonds. King Viserys, his body ravaged by disease, but his will still intact, made one final attempt to reconcile his feuding relatives. He spoke of love, of forgiveness, of the need to preserve their dynasty for future generations. But his words fell on deaf ears. The children and grandchildren who shared his blood had already chosen their sides, and the accumulated grievances of 2 decades could not be erased by a dying man's pleas for peace. As the feast concluded, and the family members returned to their separate chambers, everyone present understood that they had witnessed the end of an era. When King Viserys died quietly in his sleep that autumn night, he took with him the last restraining force that had held the realm together. The dance of dragons was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. King Viserys Targaryen died, as he had lived in his final years, quietly and without ceremony. The maesters who attended him in those last hours reported that he passed peacefully in his sleep, his body finally succumbing to the infections and fevers that had plagued him for months. But death, particularly royal death, is never truly quiet, and the king's passing set in motion a carefully orchestrated plan that had been years in the making. Queen Alicent discovered the body first, entering the royal chambers at dawn to find her husband cold and still. The sight should have prompted immediate action according to established protocol. The death of a king required the summoning of the small council, the formal announcement to the realm, and the immediate recognition of his chosen heir. Instead, Alicent made a decision that would plunge the 7 kingdoms into civil war. She sent for her father and closest allies, but told no one else of the king's death. For 6 crucial hours, the realm continued in ignorance. while a select group of conspirators gathered in the Queen's chambers to implement their long-planned coup. Otto Hightower arrived first, his face grave but unsurprised, suggesting he had been expecting this moment for some time. Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, followed shortly after, his white cloak marking him as one of the few men with legitimate access to the royal apartments at such an early hour. The meeting that followed would later be called the Green Council, though its participants saw themselves as saviors of the realm rather than usurpers of lawful authority. In their view, they were preventing a catastrophe that would result from placing a woman on the Iron Throne, particularly a woman married to the dangerous and unpredictable Daemon Targaryen. They convinced themselves that their actions served the greater good, even as they systematically violated every oath of loyalty they had sworn. Lord Jasper Wilde, the Master of Laws, provided the legal justification for their actions. He argued that the Great Council of 101 had established precedent for male inheritance, and that King Viserys had acted beyond his authority in naming a female heir. The argument was sophisticated, but fundamentally flawed, ignoring the principle that kings possessed absolute power to determine succession. Nevertheless, it provided the intellectual framework that allowed honorable men to justify dishonorable actions. Grand Maester Orwyle brought word from the Citadel, claiming that the realm's learned men supported male succession as more stable and traditional. Whether this was true or simply convenient fiction, his support lent scholarly weight to their cause. The faith's position was already clear, as the High Septon had long opposed Rhaenyra's marriage to Daemon and questioned her fitness to rule. The most crucial participant was Lord Larry Strong, the Master of Whisperers, whose network of informants had spent years mapping the loyalties of every significant lord in Westeros. His intelligence revealed which houses could be counted upon to support Aegon's claim, and which would need to be neutralized or eliminated. More importantly, he had already positioned agents throughout King's Landing to control information and prevent unwanted messages from leaving the capital. The search for Prince Aegon proved more challenging than expected. The heir apparent had spent the previous evening drinking in the city's taverns and brothels, following his usual pattern of seeking pleasure in the lowest quarters of King's Landing. When his guards finally located him, he was unconscious in a flea-bottom alehouse, reeking of wine and worse. The irony was not lost on those who dragged him back to the Red Keep that the man they intended to crown as savior of the realm had to be sobered up before he could accept his throne. Aegon's initial reaction to the news was not enthusiasm, but horror. He had grown up believing that Rhaenyra would inherit and had made peace with a life of royal privilege without royal responsibility. The prospect of actually ruling terrified him, as did the knowledge that accepting the crown meant war with his half-sister and her dragon-riding husband. For several precious hours, the entire conspiracy hung in the balance while they argued with a reluctant would-be king. Queen Alicent played the decisive role in convincing her son to accept his destiny. She spoke not of glory or power, but of duty and protection, arguing that Rhaenyra's rule would inevitably lead to the execution of all potential rivals. In this she was probably correct. History suggested that new monarchs often eliminated competing claimants, and Daemon's reputation for violence made such a purge almost certain. Aegon's choice was not between ruling and freedom, but between ruling and dying. The coronation took place in the Dragon Pit before a hastily assembled crowd of King's Landing residents. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. By crowning Aegon in the ancient home of dragons, rather than the Red Keep's throne room, the Greens emphasized his legitimacy as heir to the Conqueror's legacy. The setting also allowed them to control who attended, filling the massive structure with their supporters while excluding potential dissidents. Sir Criston Cole placed the crown of Aegon the Conqueror upon the new king's head, the golden circlet catching the morning light as it settled on silver hair. The crowd's response was mixed, but generally positive, as common folk rarely concerned themselves with the finer points of royal succession. They saw a handsome young king crowned in traditional ceremony, and many genuinely cheered as trumpets announced the dawn of a new reign. The new Queen Alicent stood beside her son, no longer the Queen Dowager, but the Queen Mother, her influence now backed by royal authority rather than simply matrimonial position. Her other children flanked the throne, with Princess Rhaenyra as the new queen consort and Prince Aemond as the king's most formidable supporter. Prince Daeron remained in Old Town, but word had already been sent to secure his loyalty and prepare the Hightower forces for the coming conflict. Meanwhile, on Dragonstone, Princess Rhaenyra remained completely unaware of her father's death and her throne's usurpation. The ancient fortress sat isolated in Blackwater Bay, its communication with the outside world easily controlled by those who commanded the Royal Navy. For crucial days, she continued her normal routine while her enemies consolidated power and eliminated threats throughout the capital. The purge began immediately after the coronation, though it was conducted with more subtlety than typical royal house cleanings. Lord Caswell of Bitterbridge, one of Rhaenyra's most vocal supporters, was found dead in his chambers, apparently a suicide, though many suspected poison. Sir Eric and Sir Eric Cargill, twin knights of the Kingsguard, known for their loyalty to the crown rather than any faction, were offered a choice between accepting the new king or facing execution for treason. Lord Commander Harold Westerling faced the most difficult decision of all. The aging knight had served faithfully for decades, sworn to protect the royal family regardless of personal preference. When commanded to arrest Rhaenyra's supporters, he refused, declaring that his oath was to the rightful heir. His principled stand cost him his position but saved his honor as he departed King's Landing with his integrity intact rather than his life. The replacement of key personnel throughout the city government proceeded with ruthless efficiency. Men whose loyalty was questionable found themselves reassigned to distant posts or simply dismissed from service. The City Watch, once commanded by Daemon Targaryen, was purged of officers who might retain affection for their former leader. Gold cloaks who had served faithfully for years suddenly found themselves branded as potential traitors and replaced by men whose allegiance was certain. Princess Rhaenys presented the greatest immediate danger to the new regime. As the queen who never was, she commanded significant respect throughout the realm, and her presence in King's Landing during the transition made her a natural rallying point for opposition. Her dragon Meleys, the Red Queen, could single-handedly destroy the Green forces if she chose to act decisively. The Greens' attempt to secure her support revealed both their desperation and their misunderstanding of her character. They offered her granddaughters favorable marriages and her house continued prosperity in exchange for recognizing Aegon's legitimacy. The proposition was generous by most standards, acknowledging Valyrian power while securing their neutrality in the coming conflict. Rhaenys listened to their offers with the patience that comes from decades of political experience, but her response was swift and definitive. Rather than accepting their terms or openly refusing them, she requested permission to depart King's Landing immediately to return to Driftmark. The request seemed reasonable enough, and the Greens, confident in their control of the situation, granted it readily. What followed became one of the most dramatic moments in Targaryen history. Instead of departing quietly through the city gates as expected, Rhaenys made her way to the Dragon Pit where Meleys was housed. The ancient building, still filled with supporters celebrating Aegon's coronation, erupted in chaos as the Red Queen burst through the floor of the arena in an explosion of stone and dragonfire. The sight was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Meleys, her scales gleaming like polished copper in the dusty air, reared above the panicking crowd with Rhaenys mounted regally upon her back. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the dragon and rider surveyed the scene below them, weighing the choice between mercy and vengeance. Queen Alicent stepped protectively in front of her son, her courage in that moment unquestionable, even if her politics were debatable. Prince Aegon, to his credit, did not flee or cower, though his face showed the terror that any reasonable person would feel when confronted by an angry dragon. The crowd pressed against the walls of the pit, trapped between the beast above and their own crushing numbers. Rhaenys could have ended the civil war before it truly began. A single word of command would have reduced the Green leadership to ash and bone, leaving Rhaenyra's path to the throne clear and uncontested. The temptation must have been enormous, particularly given the years of slights and dismissals she had endured from the Hightower faction. But she chose mercy over justice, perhaps because she understood that murdering a newly crowned king before a crowd of witnesses would make her the villain of any story told afterward. Or perhaps she simply retained enough faith in human decency to believe that civil war could still be avoided through negotiation and compromise. Whatever her reasoning, she commanded Meleys to climb rather than breathe fire, departing King's Landing in a display of power rather than an act of destruction. Her flight to Dragonstone carried with it the first reliable news of King Viserys' death and Aegon's coronation. The message she bore would transform Princess Rhaenyra from comfortable heir into desperate claimant, beginning the next phase of a conflict that would consume the Seven Kingdoms for the next 2 years. The Greens had won the first battle through speed, organization, and ruthless determination. They controlled the capital, the treasury, and the symbolic heart of royal power. But they had also committed themselves to a path that made compromise impossible and war inevitable. In seizing the throne, they had ensured that Rhaenyra would have no choice but to fight for it, and fighting dragons was always a dangerous proposition. The Dance of Dragons was about to begin in earnest, and the realm would never be the same. The news of her father's death and her throne's usurpation struck Rhaenyra like a physical blow. Princess Rhaenyra delivered the devastating report in the ancient hall of Dragonstone, her words echoing off the dragon-carved walls that had witnessed centuries of Targaryen triumphs and tragedies. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the woman who believed herself the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms stood frozen in shock, unable to process the magnitude of her family's betrayal. The grief came first, raw and overwhelming. King Viserys had been more than a father to Rhaenyra. He had been her champion, her protector, and the source of her legitimacy. His death meant not only personal loss, but the severing of her strongest claim to royal authority. Without the king's living voice to defend her rights, she became just another claimant in a realm that had never willingly accepted female rule. Then came the rage, white-hot and consuming. The image of her half-brother, wearing her father's crown, while her father's body still lay warm in the royal chambers, filled her with a fury that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. Daemon, recognizing the dangerous glint in his wife's violet eyes, placed a restraining hand on her arm as she reached for the great sword that hung above the fireplace. Violence would come, but it must be calculated rather than spontaneous. The transformation from princess to queen claimant required immediate and dramatic action. Within hours of receiving the news, Rhaenyra convened her own coronation ceremony in the ancient throne room of Dragonstone. The setting could not have been more different from Aegon's public spectacle in King's Landing, where his ceremony emphasized popular support and traditional grandeur. Hers focused on legitimacy and historical precedent. The throne room of Dragonstone had never hosted a coronation before, but its atmosphere was perfectly suited to the occasion. Carved dragons seemed to emerge from every surface, their obsidian eyes catching the firelight as if alive and watching. The throne itself, carved from a single block of volcanic stone, bore the weathered features of ancient Valyrian dragons, connecting the ceremony to powers far older than the Iron Throne itself. Daemon placed the crown upon his wife's head, the circlet of Valyrian steel and rubies catching the torchlight as it settled upon silver hair. Unlike Aegon's crown, which belonged to the conqueror himself, this diadem had been crafted specifically for Rhaenyra years earlier, when her father first named her heir. Its relative newness mattered less than its symbolism, representing a future that might have been rather than a past that could never be reclaimed. The assembled witnesses were fewer in number than those who had acclaimed Aegon, but they represented formidable power nonetheless. Lord Corlys Velaryon knelt first, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he swore the oath that bound his house's considerable naval strength to her cause. His wife Rhaenys followed, the queen who never was finally bending the knee to another woman, perhaps seeing in Rhaenyra the vindication of her own lost claim. The ceremony concluded with the lighting of the great beacon atop Dragonmont, a signal that had not been used since the conquest itself. The flame, visible from the mainland on clear nights, announced to friend and foe alike that the Dragon Princess had claimed her birthright and would defend it with fire and blood. The next weeks brought a flood of ravens carrying messages of support, defiance, and conditional loyalty from across the Seven Kingdoms. The great houses were forced to choose between two competing claims, each backed by formidable military power and legitimate grievances. The decisions they made would determine not only the war's outcome, but the fate of their own families for generations to come. The North declared for Rhaenyra almost immediately, with Lord Cregan Stark's message arriving within days of her coronation. The Stark declaration carried enormous weight, not only because of the North's military strength, but because of their reputation for honor and oath-keeping. When the Starks gave their word, the entire realm knew it could be trusted absolutely. Their support lent moral authority to Rhaenyra's cause that no amount of gold or political maneuvering could purchase. The Riverlands proved more complex, with individual houses making different choices based on local concerns and historical grudges. House Tully of Riverrun declared for the Queen, bringing with them the powerful current of the Trident and control of the realm's agricultural heartland. But other Riverlords hesitated, remembering Prince Daemon's harsh rule as commander of the City Watch and fearing his influence over his wife's decisions. The Vale remained officially neutral initially, though many individual lords favored Rhaenyra due to her mother's Arryn blood and her own strong connections to the Mountain Kingdom. Lady Jane Arryn, the Maiden of the Vale, eventually declared for the Queen after extracting promises of continued autonomy and protection for her own contested rule. The Vale's declaration brought both military strength and moral legitimacy, as House Arryn had always been considered one of the most honorable in Westeros. The Reach presented the most complicated political landscape of all. House Hightower's influence ran deep throughout the region, with marriage alliances and economic ties binding many lesser houses to their cause. Yet the Reach also contained some of Rhaenyra's strongest supporters, particularly House Beesbury and several others who had benefited from her father's policies. The result was a patchwork of competing loyalties that would turn the Reach into a battlefield throughout the coming war. Dawn, as always, remained aloof from the conflicts of the Seven Kingdoms proper. Prince Coron Martell sent polite messages to both claimants, but committed to neither, preferring to wait and see how the conflict developed before choosing a side. This neutrality was perhaps the wisest course available, as it allowed Dawn to avoid the devastation that would consume the rest of Westeros. The distribution of dragons between the two factions would prove crucial to the war's conduct and outcome. Rhaenyra's side initially controlled more adult dragons, though Aegon's faction possessed some of the largest and most experienced beasts. Syrax remained bonded to the Queen herself, a magnificent golden dragon whose size and beauty made her a perfect symbol of royal majesty. Caraxes served Prince Daemon, the bloodworm's speed and ferocity complementing his rider's aggressive nature perfectly. The Velaryon dragons added considerable strength to the Black cause. Meleys, ridden by Princess Rhaenys, was among the swiftest dragons alive and had already proven her worth in the dramatic escape from King's Landing. Seasmoke, once bonded to the late Laenor Velaryon, remained riderless but showed signs of accepting a new partner among the dragon seeds being recruited for the Queen's service. Rhaenyra's children brought their own dragons to the conflict. Prince Jacaerys commanded Vermax, a young but promising beast whose green and bronze scales gleamed like polished metal. Prince Lucerys rode Arax, smaller than his brother's mount but swift and agile in flight. Even young Prince Joffrey had claimed a dragon, though Tyraxes was still too small for warfare. The Green faction's dragons were fewer in number, but included some of the most formidable beasts in existence. Vhagar, ridden by Prince Aemond, dwarfed all other living dragons in size and experience. The ancient she-dragon had carried Queen Visenya during the conquest and remembered battles from a century past. Her mere presence on the battlefield could decide the outcome of engagements before they truly began. Sunfire, King Aegon's mount, was considered the most beautiful dragon in the world, his golden scales shimmering like molten metal in sunlight. Though smaller than Vhagar, he was fully grown and capable of devastating destruction when roused to anger. Drimfire, bonded to Queen Rhaenyra, was another ancient beast whose pale blue scales and silver crests made her easily recognizable from great distances. The search for additional dragon riders became a priority for both sides, leading to the controversial dragon seed programs that would define much of the war's middle phase. The Targaryens had always maintained that only those with Valyrian blood could successfully bond with dragons, but the desperate need for more riders forced them to test this assumption. Throughout the realm, men and women with even the faintest trace of Dragon Lord ancestry were summoned to attempt the dangerous process of claiming wild dragons. Dragonstone itself housed several unclaimed beasts in the volcanic caves beneath the castle. Vermithor the Bronze Fury, who had once carried King Jaehaerys, was the largest of these wild dragons, nearly rivaling Vhagar in size, though not in experience. Silverwing, his former companion who had carried good Queen Alicent, remained nearby, the two ancient dragons maintaining a partnership that had lasted decades beyond their riders' deaths. The process of claiming wild dragons proved extraordinarily dangerous, with more would-be riders dying than succeeding in their attempts. Those who survived the bonding process often emerged changed by the experience, marked by an otherworldly confidence that set them apart from ordinary men. These new dragon riders would play crucial roles in the battles to come, though their loyalties would prove as volatile as the beasts they commanded. Naval power represented another crucial factor in the developing conflict. Lord Corlys Velaryon commanded the largest fleet in Westeros, with hundreds of warships and thousands of experienced sailors under his command. The Velaryon fleet had dominated the narrow sea for generations, their knowledge of currents, weather patterns, and hidden anchorages giving them enormous advantages over any potential opponents. The royal fleet based in King's Landing was substantial but less experienced, having spent more time on ceremonial duties than actual warfare. Many of its commanders were political appointees rather than seasoned naval officers, and their loyalty to the new regime remained questionable. The Greens would need to either win over these officers or replace them with more reliable supporters. Economic factors also played a vital role in preparing for war. The royal treasury in King's Landing contained substantial reserves accumulated during King Viserys' peaceful reign, giving the Greens immediate access to the gold needed to hire mercenaries and purchase supplies. However, Rhaenyra controlled Dragonstone's ancient treasures, including Valyrian steel weapons and dragon eggs that could be sold to foreign buyers for enormous sums. Trade relationships complicated the economic picture. Further, the free cities of Essos had extensive commercial ties with both factions, and their decisions about which side to support could significantly impact the war's duration and outcome. Braavos, with its powerful Iron Bank, maintained strict neutrality while quietly assessing which claimant was more likely to honor existing debts and future obligations. As winter approached in 129 AC, Both queens had assembled formidable military coalitions and were preparing for a conflict that would test every aspect of their power and determination. The stage was set for a war that would reshape Westeros forever, though neither side yet understood the true cost of the victory they sought so desperately. The first drops of blood in the Dance of Dragons fell not from dragon fire, but from ancient hatreds that had simmered in the Riverlands for generations. House Blackwood and House Bracken, whose rivalry stretched back to the days of the First Men, found in the royal succession crisis the perfect excuse to settle old scores with steel and flame. Their conflict at the burning mill would establish the brutal precedent that would define the entire war. The battle itself began almost by accident, the result of a chance encounter between rival patrols rather than careful military planning. Sir Amos Bracken led a column of knights northward along the Red Fork, ostensibly to secure loyalty oaths from minor lords, but actually seeking an opportunity to strike at Blackwood holdings. Lord Samwell Blackwood anticipated this move, positioning his own forces near the ancient mill that marked the traditional boundary between their lands. The mill had stood beside the rushing waters for 3 centuries, its great wheel turning grain into flour for dozens of surrounding villages. Local legends claim that the stones themselves were cursed, ground from rock taken from the crypts of long-dead kings, and that any blood spilled there would call forth vengeful spirits. Whether the supernatural claims held truth or not, the mill's isolation made it perfect for the kind of private warfare that both houses preferred. The initial skirmish erupted when Bracken outriders encountered Blackwood sentries in the pre-dawn darkness. Shouts of challenge turned to clash of steel within moments, as generations of mutual hatred overwhelmed any pretense of restraint. The sound of battle drew both main forces toward the mill, where the narrow bridge provided a natural choke point that would force a decisive engagement. What followed was less a battle than a slaughter, as the confined space prevented either side from employing sophisticated tactics. Knights charged across the bridge in small groups, only to be cut down by defenders who had claimed the superior position. The mill wheel, still turning despite the violence erupting around it, became splattered with blood and gore as bodies fell into the rushing water below. The turning point came when young Ben Blackwood, barely 16, but already marked by the fierce pride of his house, challenged Sir Amos Bracken to single combat. The older knight, confident in his experience and superior equipment, accepted gladly, seeing an opportunity to end the battle by killing the Blackwood heir. Their duel atop the narrow bridge became the stuff of songs. 2 warriors balanced precariously above the rushing water, while their followers watched in tense silence. Ben's victory was as decisive as it was unexpected. The boy's speed and desperation overcame Bracken's skill and experience, and when the older knight's body tumbled into the Red Fork, his followers lost heart for further fighting. The surviving Brackens retreated towards Stone Hedge, leaving the field and dozens of their dead to the victorious Blackwoods. The aftermath of the burning mill resonated far beyond the immediate participants. Word of the battle spread throughout the Riverlands within days, carried by survivors, merchants, and the ever-present ravens that served as the realm's communication network. Each telling embellished the details, transforming a relatively minor skirmish into an epic clash that seemed to prophesy the greater conflicts to come. More importantly, the battle forced neutrals throughout the Riverlands to choose sides, as continued fence-sitting became impossible in the face of open warfare. Lord Tully's declaration for Queen Rhaenyra gained substance and urgency when backed by Blackwood steel, while the Bracken support for King Aegon carried the weight of fresh martyrs. The abstract political conflict had become a very real military campaign. Prince Daemon Targaryen received word of the battle while preparing his own campaign from Dragonstone. The news pleased him enormously, not because he bore any particular affection for House Blackwood, but because it meant the war had truly begun. Daemon had spent too many years in exile and peaceful pursuits, his warrior's instincts dulled by political maneuvering and domestic concerns. The prospect of returning to what he did best, commanding dragons in battle, filled him with an energy that had been absent for too long. His target was Harrenhal, the massive ruined castle that controlled the heart of the Riverlands. The fortress had stood empty since the mysterious death of Lord Lionel Strong and his heir Sir Harwin, its halls echoing with nothing but wind and the whispers of servants who spoke of curses and hauntings. Yet despite its reputation for doom, Harrenhal remained strategically crucial, its position allowing whoever held it to dominate the roads between north and south. The flight from Dragonstone to Harrenhal took Daemon and Caraxes across the breadth of the Riverlands, a journey that served both military and propaganda purposes. The sight of the bloodworm passing overhead sent a clear message to all below about which queen commanded the loyalty of dragons. Villages that might have wavered in their allegiance found their decision simplified by the reality of dragonfire overhead. Caraxes was perfectly suited for this kind of psychological warfare. His unusual red coloring made him easily recognizable from great distances, while his serpentine build gave him an otherworldly appearance that seemed more demon than dragon. When he screamed, the sound carried for miles across the flat river plains, announcing Daemon's approach long before the dragon himself became visible. The taking of Harrenhal proved anticlimactic after the dramatic flight to reach it. The castle's skeleton garrison, commanded by a nervous young knight named Sir Simon Strong, offered no resistance when confronted with a dragon and its rider. The sight of Caraxes perched atop the melted towers that Balerion the Black Dread had destroyed nearly 2 centuries earlier must have seemed like history repeating itself in the most ominous possible way. Daemon's occupation of the cursed castle marked the beginning of the most mysterious phase of his entire life. Within days of taking residence in Harrenhal's restored chambers, he began experiencing vivid dreams and waking visions that seemed to blur the line between prophecy and madness. The castle's reputation for driving its occupants to destruction appeared to be asserting itself once again. Alicent Rivers, the bastard daughter of the late Lord Lionel Strong, emerged as a key figure in these strange events, described by those who met her as ageless. Despite her mortal birth, she possessed knowledge of herb lore and ancient customs that made her invaluable to a prince seeking to understand the supernatural forces that seemed to permeate the castle. Whether she was witch, wise woman, or simply a clever survivor, her influence over Daemon grew stronger with each passing day. The dreams that plagued Daemon's nights at Harrenhal would later be interpreted as prophetic visions of the war's eventual outcome. He saw dragons falling from burning skies, kings crowned and deposed in rapid succession, and a winter that would last for generations. Most disturbing of all, he witnessed his own death in the black waters of the God's Eye, locked in mortal combat with his nephew Aemond, while their dragons tore each other apart in the skies above. Yet, despite these ominous portents, Daemon's military campaign in the Riverlands proceeded with remarkable success. His mere presence at Harrenhal served as a rallying point for Queen Rhaenyra's supporters throughout the region, while the threat of dragonfire convinced many wavering lords to declare their allegiance openly. The ancient maxim that fear was more reliable than love proved itself once again in the muddy fields of the Riverlands. The strategic importance of controlling the Riverlands extended far beyond the region itself. The network of rivers that gave the area its name served as highways for transporting troops and supplies, while the fertile farmlands fed much of Westeros during times of peace. More importantly, the Riverlands connected the north to the southern kingdoms, making it the natural invasion route for any army seeking to march between the regions. King Aegon's forces, concentrated primarily in King's Landing and the Reach, found themselves increasingly isolated as Daemon's influence spread throughout the river territories. Supply lines that had once carried grain and goods to the capital now served Queen Rhaenyra's cause, while recruitment efforts for the royal army faced active opposition from hostile populations. The green response came in the form of Sir Criston Cole's march northward from King's Landing at the head of a substantial army. The newly appointed Hand of the King had spent weeks assembling forces from the Crown lands and securing mercenary companies with royal gold. His reputation as both warrior and kingmaker made him a formidable opponent, while his personal hatred for Rhaenyra added emotional intensity to what might otherwise have been a purely strategic campaign. Cole's army represented the largest royal force fielded since the conquest, with thousands of professional soldiers supplemented by levies from houses throughout the Crown lands. The sight of royal banners marching beneath the autumn sun should have inspired confidence in those who witnessed it, yet many observers noted the grim determination of the soldiers rather than the enthusiasm typically associated with righteous causes. The contrast between the two armies reflected the broader differences between their respective causes. Daemon's forces consisted largely of volunteers fighting for a queen they believed had been wrongfully deposed, their motivation enhanced by personal loyalty and righteous anger. Cole's soldiers served for duty and pay rather than passion, many harboring private doubts about the legitimacy of the king they served. The inevitable clash between these forces would determine control of the Riverlands and possibly the entire war's outcome. But before armies could meet in pitched battle, individual acts of heroism and treachery would shape the conflict's character and establish the bitter precedents that would define the remainder of the Dance of Dragons. Meanwhile, other fronts began opening as the war expanded beyond its initial boundaries. The naval blockade of King's Landing tightened as Valyrian ships took control of Blackwater Bay, cutting off the capital from seaborne trade and reinforcement. Food shortages began affecting the common people of the city, creating the kind of popular unrest that had toppled dynasties in the past. The psychological impact of these early reverses weighed heavily on King Aegon's court. The easy victory they had expected was proving elusive, while Queen Rhaenyra's forces seemed to grow stronger with each passing week. Doubts began creeping into even the most confident Green supporters as they wondered whether they had chosen the losing side in a conflict that showed no signs of quick resolution. The Dance of Dragons had truly begun, and already it was clear that this would be no ordinary succession dispute. The involvement of dragons on both sides guaranteed that the destruction would be unprecedented, while the bitter personal animosities driving the conflict made compromise increasingly impossible. The realm was committed to a path that could only end in victory for one side and utter devastation for the other. The transformation of Prince Lucerys Valerian from beloved grandson to reluctant messenger would prove to be one of the war's most tragic ironies. At 14, Luke possessed all the gentle qualities that made him unsuitable for the brutal conflict consuming his family. Unlike his elder brother Jacaerys, who embraced his role as heir with fierce determination, Luke seemed born for peace rather than war, preferring books to swords and showing kindness even to those who questioned his legitimacy. Queen Rhaenyra's decision to send her second son as an envoy to Storm's End reflected both political necessity and maternal calculation. The Baratheons had remained neutral in the early stages of the conflict, their young Lord Boros weighing offers from both claimants while his bannermen urged different courses of action. Securing Storm's End's allegiance could tip the balance in the war's southern theater, making the dangerous mission worth the risk to her son's safety. The choice of Luke as messenger was intended to demonstrate trust and respect for Lord Boros, while his youth and gentle nature should have made him less threatening than a more martial representative. Queen Rhaenyra believed that sending her own son showed the importance she placed on the Baratheon alliance, while Luke's obvious vulnerability would appeal to any lord's sense of honor and hospitality. The flight from Dragonstone to Storm's End took Luke and Arax across the stormy waters of Shipbreaker Bay, where autumn winds whipped the narrow sea into towering waves that crashed against the rocky coastline with tremendous force. The young dragon struggled against the buffeting gusts, his rider forced to trust entirely in his mount's instincts as they navigated through clouds that obscured both sea and sky. Storm's End itself loomed out of the tempest like a mountain of carved stone, its massive walls rising directly from the rocky promontory on which Duran Godsgrief had built his legendary fortress. The castle's reputation for withstanding any siege had been earned through centuries of warfare, its architects understanding that sometimes the greatest enemy was nature itself rather than human armies. Luke's arrival at the castle should have been a moment of diplomatic triumph, the successful completion of a dangerous journey in service of his mother's cause. Instead, he found the great hall already occupied by another messenger whose presence transformed the peaceful mission into something far more ominous. Prince Aemon Targaryen sat at Lord Borros's right hand, his sapphire eye gleaming like a fallen star in the torchlight, while Vhagar's massive form darkened the skies outside. The confrontation between the two princes carried the weight of years of accumulated grievances and childhood traumas. Aemond had never forgotten the night at Driftmark when Luke's blade had taken his eye, transforming him from a whole boy into something marked and dangerous. The loss had defined much of his adolescence, driving him to excel in every martial pursuit while nursing a hatred that had only grown stronger with time. Luke's horror at finding his uncle already present was evident to everyone in the hall, his face pale with the sudden understanding that his diplomatic mission had become a trap. Lord Borros, caught between two royal princes each bearing messages from competing monarchs, found himself in the impossible position of choosing between them while both dragons waited outside his walls. The Baratheon Lord's decision to hear both messages before declaring his allegiance demonstrated the political wisdom that had kept his house powerful for centuries. He listened carefully as each prince presented their queen's offer, weighing not only the immediate benefits but the long-term implications of supporting either claimant. The assembled Baratheon knights watched in tense silence, understanding that their lord's choice would determine their own fate in the coming war. Aemond's message from King Aegon came with substantial promises of reward and alliance, backed by the immediate presence of the realm's most powerful dragon. Vhagar's shadow falling across Storm's End provided a compelling argument for the green cause, reminding everyone present that dragons made more persuasive diplomats than words alone. The prince himself radiated controlled menace, his every gesture calculated to project strength and confidence. Luke's message from Queen Rhaenyra offered different incentives, emphasizing legal legitimacy and the binding nature of old oaths sworn to support her claim. His youth and obvious nervousness undermined his diplomatic effectiveness, though his courage in delivering the message despite clear personal danger earned grudging respect from the watching knights. Lord Borros's eventual decision to support King Aegon surprised no one who understood Baratheon psychology. The Storm Lords had always respected strength above all other virtues, and Aemond's presence with the mighty Vhagar made the choice seem obvious from a practical standpoint. The promise of a marriage alliance between one of his daughters and the prince sweetened the arrangement considerably. The dismissal of Luke's embassy should have ended the diplomatic encounter, but Aemond's personal hatred transformed what should have been a simple rejection into something far more sinister. As the young prince prepared to depart, his uncle's voice stopped him with words that would echo through history and haunt the nightmares of survivors. "Did you really think you could fly about the realm trying to steal my brother's throne at no cost?" Aemond's question carried years of suppressed rage and a threat that made every man in the hall hold his breath. The sapphire in his empty socket seemed to pulse with its own inner fire as he fixed his remaining eye on the nephew who had maimed him. Luke's response revealed both his youth and his growing understanding of the danger he faced. "I will not fight you. I came as a messenger, not a warrior." The words should have ended the confrontation, appealing to the ancient laws of hospitality that protected envoys even during wartime. But hatred had moved beyond such civilized constraints. Aemon's demand for payment, an eye for an eye taken years before, hung in the air like a physical presence. The assembled Baratheons shifted uncomfortably, caught between their duty to protect a guest and their new alliance with the prince who threatened him. Lord Boros faced an impossible choice between honor and expedience, his decision complicated by the certain knowledge that refusing Aemon could mean Vhagar's fire consuming his castle. The tension finally broke when Luke, recognizing that words would not save him, bowed hastily and fled toward the castle's entrance. His departure should have ended the crisis, but Aemon's pursuit transformed diplomatic immunity into mortal peril. The chase that followed would become one of the most infamous episodes in the entire war. The storm that raged outside Storm's End provided a dramatic backdrop for the aerial pursuit that followed. Luke reached Arrax first, the young dragon responding immediately to his rider's urgency despite the howling winds and driving rain. Their takeoff was desperate rather than graceful, the pair climbing rapidly into the gray clouds that offered concealment from the monster behind them. Vhagar's pursuit began with deliberate menace, rather than immediate attack. The ancient dragon's massive wings beat slowly as she rose from the castle courtyard, her size making her climbing seem effortless despite the storm's fury. Aemon's control over his mount was absolute, the result of years spent bonding with the temperamental beast who had once carried Queen Visenya to war. The chase above Shipbreaker Bay became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Arrax using his smaller size and greater agility to evade Vhagar's attempts to close the distance between them. Luke's dragon was young and fast, capable of maneuvers that the larger beast could not match, but endurance favored the pursuer over the pursued. The storm winds that helped hide the smaller dragon also provided cover for his much larger enemy. What happened next in those storm-darkened skies remains one of the most debated moments in Targaryen history. The official Green account claimed that Aemon intended only to frighten his nephew, not kill him, and that Vhagar acted beyond her rider's control when she finally caught and devoured both Arrax and Luke. Supporters of this version point to Aemon's apparent shock when he returned to Storm's End alone, his face pale and his manner subdued. The Black interpretation painted the encounter as deliberate murder, arguing that Aemon had planned Luke's death from the moment he saw his nephew enter Lord Boros's hall. They claimed that his pursuit was methodical rather than impulsive, and that Vhagar's attack came at his direct command rather than through any failure of control. The truth, as is often the case in matters of life and death, likely fell somewhere between these extremes. Aemon certainly intended to terrify Luke, to extract some psychological payment for the eye he had lost years before. Whether he meant to kill his nephew or simply to humiliate him became irrelevant once Vhagar's predatory instincts overwhelmed whatever restraint her rider might have intended. The manner of Luke's death was as brutal as it was swift. Vhagar's massive jaws closed around Arrax with the finality of a steel trap. The smaller dragon's struggles lasting only moments before both rider and mount disappeared into the storm-tossed waters below. The young prince who had flown out that morning, full of nervous hope, became merely another casualty in a war that had already consumed too many innocents. The news of Luke's death reached Dragonstone with devastating impact, carried by survivors who had witnessed the aerial battle from Storm's End's walls. Queen Rhaenyra's grief was terrible to behold, the loss of her gentle son striking her like a physical blow that left her momentarily unable to speak or move. When words finally came, they carried a cold fury that promised vengeance beyond anything the realm had yet witnessed. Daemon's reaction was more immediately violent, his warrior's instincts demanding immediate retaliation against those responsible for his stepson's murder. The prince, who had spent years moderating his more savage impulses, found himself overwhelmed by rage that threatened to consume all rational thought. Only Rhaenyra's direct intervention prevented him from flying immediately to King's Landing to burn the Red Keep in revenge. The transformation of the conflict from political dispute to blood feud was complete. Luke's death made compromise impossible and ensured that the war would continue until one side achieved total victory or both destroyed themselves in the attempt. The gentle boy who had never wanted to fight had become the spark that would ignite the most destructive phase of the Dance of Dragons. Prince Jacaerys took the news of his brother's death with the grim determination that would define much of his remaining life. The heir to Dragonstone understood immediately that Luke's murder changed everything, transforming their cause from a quest for rightful inheritance into a war of vengeance that could accept no outcome except the complete destruction of their enemies. The realm itself seemed to recoil from the implications of Luke's death, as if the very air had become poisoned by the deliberate killing of a diplomatic envoy. Ravens carried the news to every corner of Westeros, and the responses revealed a kingdom horrified by the breakdown of civilized warfare. Even houses that supported King Aegon privately questioned whether Aemon's actions had crossed lines that should never be violated. King Aegon's own reaction to his brother's deed was reportedly one of shock rather than celebration, though whether this reflected genuine horror or political calculation remained unclear. The young king was beginning to understand that ruling required different qualities than simply possessing royal blood, and that his brother's uncontrolled violence might prove as dangerous to their cause as any enemy army. The first dragon had fallen, but it would not be the last. Luke's death above Shipbreaker Bay marked the true beginning of the Dance of Dragons, the moment when political calculation gave way to primal fury and the war transformed from succession dispute into apocalyptic catastrophe. The gentle prince who had died in those storm-darkened skies would be remembered as the first victim of dragonfire, but he would not be the last. The realm held its breath, waiting for Queen Rhaenyra's response to her son's murder, knowing that whatever came next would make the previous battles seem like mere skirmishes by comparison. The news of Prince Lucerys' death reached Harrenhal like a thunderclap in the depths of winter, transforming Prince Daemon from a calculating general into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The great hall of the cursed castle, already heavy with shadows and whispered legends, seemed to darken further as the prince received word of his stepson's murder above Shipbreaker Bay. Those who witnessed his reaction spoke later of a man possessed, his violet eyes blazing with fury that seemed to burn with dragonfire itself. Daemon's response was swift and merciless, though it took a form that none expected. Rather than flying immediately to Storm's End for direct vengeance against Prince Aemond, he turned his attention to a more subtle but equally devastating form of retaliation. If King Aegon's supporters wanted to play the game of murdering children, Daemon would teach them that too could participate in such entertainment. The recruitment of blood and cheese represented Daemon at his most coldly calculating, employing the same kind of methodical planning that had made him such an effective commander of the City Watch decades earlier. Blood was a former gold cloak who knew every secret passage and hidden entrance in the Red Keep, while Cheese was a rat catcher whose knowledge of the castle's vermin-infested tunnels made him nearly invisible to the guards who protected the royal family. The pair made an unlikely but devastatingly effective team, their combined expertise allowing them to penetrate security that should have been impregnable. Blood's understanding of guard rotations and patrol routes complemented Cheese's intimate knowledge of the castle's hidden spaces, creating opportunities for infiltration that no external assault could have achieved. Their mission was as specific as it was horrifying. Daemon's instructions were precise in their cruelty, demanding a son for a son, an heir for an heir. The fact that King Aegon's children were innocent of their uncle's crimes mattered nothing to a man consumed by grief and rage. In Daemon's view, Aemon's action had shattered the last vestiges of civilized warfare, making any retaliation not only justified but necessary. The infiltration of the Red Keep required weeks of careful preparation, as the two assassins mapped guard schedules, identified vulnerable entry points, and studied the daily routines of their intended targets. The castle that had once seemed like an impregnable fortress revealed itself to be riddled with weaknesses when examined by men who understood its hidden architecture. Queen Rhaenyra's chambers were chosen as the primary target, not because of any personal animosity toward the gentle queen, but because she represented the most accessible route to King Aegon's children. Unlike the heavily guarded king himself, the queen maintained a more relaxed household, trusting in the castle's overall security rather than maintaining constant vigilance in her private apartments. The night of the assassination was chosen to coincide with a feast in the Great Hall, ensuring that most of the castle's attention would be focused on the celebration rather than routine security. Blood and Cheese moved through the shadows like specters, their knowledge of the castle's layout allowing them to avoid both guards and servants as they made their way toward the royal quarters. Finding Queen Rhaenyra alone with her children should have simplified their task. But the assassins faced an unexpected complication when they discovered not one but two young princes in the royal nursery. Their instructions had been clear about taking a son, but the presence of both Jaehaerys and Maelor forced them to make a choice that would haunt the Seven Kingdoms for generations. The decision to force Queen Rhaenyra herself to choose which of her children would die represented cruelty beyond any military necessity. Blood and Cheese could have simply killed both boys or selected their victim randomly, but they chose instead to inflict maximum psychological damage on the young mother who had never harmed anyone in her entire life. Rhaenyra's choice of Maelor, her younger son, reflected a mother's desperate calculation that the realm's heir should be preserved even at the cost of her baby's life. But the assassin's decision to kill Prince Jaehaerys instead, claiming it would be kinder to spare the boy his mother had been willing to sacrifice, added a final twist of psychological torture to an already devastating crime. The murder itself was swift and brutal, accomplished with the kind of efficiency that Blood had learned during his years enforcing Daemon's harsh justice in Flayt Bottom. The young prince died without understanding why strangers had entered his nursery or why his mother screamed with such terrible anguish. His last sight was his mother's face, twisted with grief and horror, that would mark her for the remainder of her brief life. The escape from the Red Keep proved as carefully planned as the infiltration, with Blood and Cheese disappearing into the city's maze of alleyways and hidden passages before the alarm could be raised. By the time guards responded to Queen Rhaenyra's screams, the assassins had vanished like morning mist, leaving behind only a dead prince and a traumatized mother whose sanity would never fully recover. King Aegon's reaction to his son's murder exceeded even Daemon's expectations for causing pain and chaos within the Green faction. The young king's grief transformed into a rage that consumed all rational thought, leading to mass arrests, executions, and purges that alienated many of his supporters while failing to capture the actual perpetrators of the crime. The hunt for Blood and Cheese became an obsession that distracted Aegon from more pressing military concerns, with hundreds of gold cloaks deployed to search every corner of King's Landing while the real war continued beyond the city's walls. The irony that Daemon's former subordinates were hunting assassins in service of his revenge would have amused the prince if he had possessed any capacity for humor in those dark days. Meanwhile, the broader military campaign in the Riverlands proceeded with methodical efficiency as Daemon established control over the region's strategic heartland. His base at Harrenhal served as both symbol and practical headquarters for a campaign that combined traditional warfare with the psychological impact of dragonfire employed against military targets. The recruitment of Riverlords to Queen Rhaenyra's cause required a delicate balance of persuasion and intimidation, as houses that had remained neutral found themselves forced to choose sides by the presence of Carrexes in their skies. Daemon's reputation for both brilliance and brutality made him an effective ambassador for those who valued strength, while his connection to the royal bloodline impressed lords who cared more about legitimacy than personal preference. House Tully's declaration for Queen Rhaenyra brought with it control of River Run and the strategic advantages of commanding the region's river network. The ancient castle's position at the confluence of the Red Fork and Tumblestone made it a natural headquarters for coordinating military movements throughout the Riverlands, while its substantial garrison provided trained soldiers for the broader campaign. The Blackwoods, emboldened by their victory at the Burning Mill, became some of Daemon's most effective supporters. Their knowledge of local terrain and long-standing grudges against green-aligned houses, making them natural allies in the struggle for regional control. Young Ben Blackwood's growing reputation as a warrior added credibility to the Black cause, while providing a heroic figure around which other young lords could rally. The gradual isolation of green strongholds throughout the Riverlands demonstrated the effectiveness of Daemon's strategy of combining political persuasion with military pressure. Castles that might have resisted conventional siege found themselves cut off from reinforcement and supply, their lords faced with the choice between surrender and the kind of destruction that only Dragonfire could deliver. The economic impact of controlling the Riverlands extended far beyond the immediate military advantages, as the region's agricultural production and river-based trade routes provided crucial resources for sustaining Queen Rhaenyra's war effort. The ability to deny these same resources to King Aegon's forces multiplied the strategic value of Daemon's campaign exponentially. Harrenhal itself underwent a gradual transformation under Daemon's occupation, as the prince worked to restore sections of the massive castle that had lain in ruins since the conquest. The project served both practical and symbolic purposes, demonstrating the permanence of his presence while providing useful employment for local craftsmen whose skills might otherwise have served the enemy. Alice Rivers emerged as an increasingly important figure in this restoration effort, her knowledge of the castle's history and hidden spaces proving invaluable to a commander seeking to maximize his stronghold's defensive potential. Whether her influence over Daemon was supernatural or simply the result of feminine wisdom applied to a warrior's needs, her presence became essential to the smooth functioning of his campaign headquarters. The visions and dreams that plagued Daemon during his residence at Harrenhal took on new intensity as the war's scope expanded, with prophetic images of future battles mixing with memories of past conflicts in ways that sometimes left him unable to distinguish between what had been and what was yet to come. These episodes, witnessed by his followers and servants, added to the castle's already supernatural reputation while raising questions about the prince's fitness for continued command. Yet, despite these mysterious afflictions, Daemon's military judgment remained as sharp as ever, his strategic decisions consistently outmaneuvering green forces while maintaining the loyalty of his diverse coalition of supporters. The combination of supernatural reputation and practical effectiveness made him perhaps the most feared commander in either army, respected by allies and enemies alike. The establishment of supply lines between the Riverlands and Dragonstone created a crucial logistical network that allowed Queen Rhaenyra to support multiple theaters of operations simultaneously. The river barges that carried grain and weapons north returned laden with intelligence reports and captured green banners that served as tangible proof of Daemon's success. The psychological warfare that accompanied these military victories proved equally important in maintaining morale among Rhaenyra's supporters, while undermining confidence in King Aegon's ultimate victory. Stories of Daemon's prowess, embellished in the telling but rooted in genuine achievement, spread throughout the realm and convinced wavering lords that backing the Black Queen offered better prospects for survival than continued neutrality. The integration of dragonfire into conventional military tactics represented perhaps Daemon's greatest innovation during the Riverlands campaign, as he developed techniques for using Caraxes in support of ground forces rather than simply as an independent weapon of mass destruction. These methods would influence dragon warfare for the remainder of the conflict, setting precedents that other dragon riders would adapt for their own purposes. The success of Daemon's campaign in the Riverlands established Queen Rhaenyra's forces as a legitimate threat to King Aegon's rule, while demonstrating that the war would not be decided quickly or easily. The prince, who had once been dismissed as a rogue and adventurer, had proven himself a formidable general capable of translating raw power into strategic advantage through careful planning and ruthless execution. As autumn turned toward winter in 129 AC, Daemon's position at Harrenhal represented the high point of Black military success, with the Riverlands largely under their control and Green forces seemingly unable to mount effective resistance. Yet the very completeness of this victory would soon attract the kind of enemy attention that no amount of strategic brilliance could easily counter. Lord Staunton of Rook's Rest had made the fatal mistake of declaring too early and too loudly for Queen Rhaenyra, transforming his modest castle into a symbol that neither side could afford to ignore. The fortress itself possessed little strategic value beyond its position along the coast of the Crownlands, but symbols often matter more than substance in civil wars, and Rook's Rest had become a test of each faction's ability to protect their supporters. The castle perched on its rocky promontory like a defiant fist raised against the stormy waters of Blackwater Bay, its modest walls and towers a testament to generations of Staunton's stubbornness rather than any grand architectural vision. Yet what it lacked in size, it made up for in symbolic importance, representing the first openly declared stronghold for the Black cause within striking distance of King's Landing itself. Sir Criston Cole's decision to besiege Rook's Rest reflected both strategic calculation and personal vindication, as the newly appointed Hand of the King sought to demonstrate his worthiness for high office through decisive military action. The man who had once sworn to protect Princess Rhaenyra now found purpose in destroying her supporters, his transformation from loyal knight to bitter enemy complete in all but his own understanding. The army that Cole assembled for the siege represented one of the largest royal forces fielded since the war's beginning, with knights from throughout the Crownlands joining professional soldiers and hired sellswords in a display of green military might. The sight of so many banners flowing beneath the royal standard should have inspired confidence, yet many observers noted the grim determination of the soldiers rather than the enthusiasm typically associated with righteous causes. The siege itself proceeded according to established military doctrine, with Cole's forces establishing camps around the castle, while engineers began constructing the siege weapons necessary to breach its walls. Rook's Rest was too small to withstand a prolonged siege, but its position on the rocky coast made direct assault dangerous and costly. Time favored the attackers, but only if they could prevent outside intervention. Lord Staunton's desperate plea for assistance reached Dragonstone through fishing boats that slipped past the Royal Navy under cover of darkness, their crews risking everything to carry word of the siege to Queen Rhaenyra's court. The message itself was brief but urgent, begging for immediate relief before the castle's modest defenses were overwhelmed by superior numbers. The decision of who should respond to Staunton's call would prove to be one of the most consequential choices of the entire war. Queen Rhaenyra herself was with child and could not risk flying into battle, while Prince Daemon remained occupied with his campaign in the Riverlands. Prince Jacaerys was needed at Dragonstone to coordinate the broader war effort, leaving the dangerous mission to fall upon other members of the royal family. Princess Rhaenys volunteered for the task with the kind of quiet courage that had defined her entire life. The queen who never was had spent decades watching others make decisions about war and peace while she remained confined to the role of advisor and supporter. The opportunity to take direct action in support of her granddaughter's cause appealed to both her sense of duty and her warrior's instincts. Her choice to fly alone to Rook's Rest reflected either supreme confidence in her abilities or a fundamental misunderstanding of the danger she faced. Meleys was indeed one of the swiftest dragons alive, capable of outrunning most potential opponents, while Rhaenys herself possessed decades of experience as a dragon rider. Yet speed and experience would prove insufficient against the trap that awaited her. The flight from Dragonstone to Rook's Rest took Rhaenys across waters that had witnessed countless battles throughout Targaryen history, from Aegon's initial landing to the more recent conflicts that had shaped the dynasty's relationship with the Seven Kingdoms. The irony that she might be flying to her death in defense of a queen's claim that paralleled her own lost opportunity was not lost on those who watched her departure. Meleys herself seemed to sense the danger that awaited them, the ancient dragon displaying an unusual restlessness during the flight that her rider attributed to the approaching storm rather than any supernatural prescience. The Red Queen had fought in battles before, but always with other dragons in support, never as a solitary champion facing unknown odds in unfamiliar skies. The trap that Ser Criston Cole had prepared was both elegant and ruthless, relying on the predictable response of Rhaenyra's supporters to a threat against one of their declared allies. Cole understood that the Blacks could not afford to let Rook's Rest fall without response, as such abandonment would discourage other potential supporters from declaring their allegiance. The psychological warfare was as important as the military outcome. King Aegon's decision to participate personally in the battle represented a departure from the cautious strategy that had characterized his reign thus far. The young king had grown frustrated with his role as a symbolic figurehead, while others fought the war that would determine his dynasty's survival. The opportunity to prove himself in combat against one of his enemy's most respected champions proved too tempting to resist. Sunfire's participation added an element of royal legitimacy to what might otherwise have been dismissed as merely another skirmish between competing nobles. The Golden Dragon's presence would ensure that any victory achieved would be attributed to the king himself rather than his subordinates, enhancing Aegon's reputation as a warrior monarch rather than simply an inherited title. Prince Aemon's involvement transformed the encounter from a fair fight into something approaching murder, though his decision to participate was kept secret from most of the royal court until the battle itself began. The prince had been chafing under restrictions placed on his activities following his killing of Prince Lucerys, with many advisors arguing that his aggressive nature made him more liability than asset in the delicate game of winning hearts and minds. Vhagar's massive presence changed the fundamental nature of the battle, transforming what should have been a contest between relatively equal opponents into a confrontation between three dragons and one. The ancient she-dragon's size and experience made her nearly invincible in aerial combat, while her rider's tactical intelligence ensured that her physical advantages would be employed with maximum effectiveness. The initial phase of the battle unfolded as Cole had planned, with Rhaenys arriving over Rook's Rest to find the castle under active siege by a substantial royal army. Her first passes over the enemy camps created the expected chaos, as Meleys' fire turned siege engines to ash and scattered soldiers who had never faced dragonfire in battle. The sight of the Red Queen diving through the smoke and flames must have seemed like a vision of the Seven Hells themselves. But the trap sprung before Rhaenys could complete her mission of relieving the siege, as Sunfire rose from concealment behind the castle's rocky promontory with King Aegon mounted upon his back. The Golden Dragon's appearance should have evened the odds, creating the kind of single combat between equal opponents that songs celebrate and historians analyze. The duel between Meleys and Sunfire that followed demonstrated why dragons had once conquered the Seven Kingdoms, as the two magnificent beasts clashed in the skies above the besieged castle with a fury that shook the very foundations of the earth below. Meleys' speed and agility gave her advantages in maneuvering, while Sunfire's youth and strength allowed him to match her blow for blow in the deadly aerial dance. Princess Rhaenys fought with the skill and courage that had marked her entire life, her commands to Meleys perfectly timed and expertly executed, despite the desperate nature of their situation. The sight of the queen who never was finally engaged in the kind of battle that had been denied to her throughout her political career must have filled her with both satisfaction and regret for opportunities lost. King Aegon's performance in his first real battle exceeded the expectations of those who had dismissed him as a pleasure-seeking wastrel, his control of Sunfire demonstrating genuine skill rather than simple bravado. The young king, who had been reluctant to accept his crown, proved himself worthy of it in the crucible of dragon combat, even as the larger trap prepared by his brother began to close around both combatants. The arrival of Vhagar and Prince Aemond transformed the battle from heroic single combat into something approaching an execution, as the massive ancient dragon dwarfed both previous combatants in size and destructive potential. Aemond's timing was perfect, his intervention coming at the moment when both Meleys and Sunfire were too engaged with each other to notice the approaching threat until escape became impossible. The three-way battle that followed was unlike anything witnessed since the conquest itself, as dragons that had once shared the same roosts turned their fury against each other in a display of primal violence that reduced human concerns to insignificance. The very air seemed to burn as dragonfire crossed and recrossed the sky, while the sound of their roars carried for leagues in every direction. Meleys fought with desperate courage against impossible odds, her rider's skill keeping them alive for precious minutes that should have ended in seconds against such overwhelming opposition. But even the Red Queen's legendary speed could not overcome the numerical disadvantage, and when Vhagar's massive jaws finally closed around her neck, the outcome became inevitable. The death of Princess Rhaenys marked more than simply the loss of an experienced dragon rider, though that alone would have serious strategic implications for the Black cause. Her fall represented the end of an era, the passing of the last direct link to the great council that had shaped the succession crisis decades earlier. The queen who never was died as she had lived, with dignity and courage in service of causes greater than herself. Meleys' death throes as she plummeted toward the rocky shore below created a spectacle that would haunt the dreams of everyone who witnessed it. The ancient dragon's final moments, a reminder of the mortality that lurked beneath even the most magnificent displays of power. The Red Queen had been among the most beautiful dragons ever hatched, and her loss diminished the world in ways that transcended mere military calculation. King Aegon's own injuries in the battle's final moments demonstrated that victory often comes at unexpected costs, as Vhagar's massive claws caught both Sunfire and his rider in their deadly embrace. The king, who had proven his courage in battle, found himself broken and burned, his moment of triumph transformed into months of agony, as maesters struggled to heal wounds that might never fully mend. Sunfire's injuries were even more severe, the golden dragon's beauty marred by terrible wounds that left him grounded and in constant pain. The most magnificent dragon in the world had been reduced to a wounded beast whose flying days might be ended forever, though his legendary resilience would eventually prove such predictions premature. Prince Aemond's emergence as the battle's sole uninjured participant elevated his position within the Green faction while creating new sources of tension and rivalry. The prince who had killed Prince Lucerys and now contributed to his own brother's maiming was accumulating a reputation for both effectiveness and danger that made him valuable but potentially uncontrollable. The aftermath of Rook's Rest resonated throughout both factions as commanders and politicians struggled to understand the battle's implications for the broader war. The Greens had achieved a significant tactical victory while losing their king's active participation, while the Blacks had suffered a devastating blow to their experienced leadership just when such guidance was most needed. The siege of Rook's Rest itself became almost an afterthought as news of the dragon battle spread throughout the realm. though Lord Staunton's eventual surrender and execution provided a grim reminder that declaring for the wrong side in civil wars often carried ultimate penalties regardless of personal honor or family loyalty. The first great dragon battle of the dance was over, but the precedent it established would shape every subsequent encounter between the rival factions. The realm had witnessed the terrible reality of dragons fighting dragons, and the sight would haunt the nightmares of survivors while inspiring terror in those who heard the account secondhand. The political ramifications of the battle extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, as houses throughout the Seven Kingdoms were forced to reconsider their allegiances in light of the demonstrated costs of open rebellion. The fate of Lord Staunton and Princess Rhaenys sent a clear message about the price of supporting the wrong side, while King Aegon's injuries raised questions about the Green's ability to protect their own supporters. Prince Aemon's emergence as the primary Green military commander represented perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Rook's Rest, as his combination of tactical skill and ruthless determination made him a formidable opponent for any future Black operations. The prince, who had once been dismissed as a second son, had proven himself the most dangerous dragon rider in either faction. The loss of Meleys and her experienced rider left a gap in Black military capabilities that would be difficult, if not impossible, to fill, as the remaining dragon riders lacked either the experience or the temperament necessary to replace Princess Rhaenys' steady leadership. Queen Rhaenyra's forces would need to adapt their strategies to account for this crucial weakness. The Battle of Rook's Rest had demonstrated that the Dance of Dragons would be decided not by political maneuvering or traditional warfare, but by the terrible arithmetic of dragon against dragon. Each subsequent battle would carry the potential for catastrophic losses that could shift the war's entire trajectory in the span of a few deadly minutes. The realm held its breath, understanding that what had happened above the rocky shores of Rook's Rest was only the beginning of a conflict that would reshape the very foundations of Targaryen power. The dragons were truly dancing now, and their steps would be marked in fire and blood until only one side remained to claim victory from the ashes of the other. The death of Princess Rhaenys at Rook's Rest had stripped Queen Rhaenyra of her most experienced dragon rider at the precise moment when such expertise was most desperately needed. The loss of Meleys, combined with the grounding of King Aegon and Sunfire, had shifted the balance of aerial power in ways that threatened to decide the war's outcome before winter's end. In this crisis, Rhaenyra turned to a solution that was both revolutionary and deeply controversial: the systematic recruitment of dragon seeds to expand her core of riders beyond the traditional bounds of legitimacy. The concept of dragon seeds was as old as House Targaryen itself, born from the practical reality that not every generation produced enough true-born children to ride every available dragon. Bastards of royal blood had occasionally bonded with dragons throughout the dynasty's history, but always as exceptions rather than policy. What Rhaenyra proposed was unprecedented in both scope and systematic implementation. The ancient volcanic caves beneath Dragonstone housed several magnificent beasts that had remained riderless since their previous partners' deaths, creatures of immense power, waiting for those brave or foolish enough to attempt the bonding process. Vermithor, called the Bronze Fury, was the largest of these, a massive dragon whose copper-colored scales had earned him his nickname during his decades carrying King Jaehaerys the Conciliator. Age had not diminished his size or ferocity, though it had made him increasingly temperamental and dangerous to approach. Silverwing, Vermithor's companion and the former mount of good Queen Alicent, represented a gentler but no less formidable prospect for potential riders. Her silver scales and more docile temperament made her seem approachable, but decades of widowhood had left her melancholy and unpredictable. The ancient she-dragon had formed an unusual partnership with Vermithor since their riders' deaths, the two beasts sharing the mountain's heights in a bond that transcended human understanding. Seasmoke presented a different challenge entirely, his grief for the lost Lenore Valerian making him hostile to most who attempted to approach his lair. The pearl and silver dragon had been among the war's earliest casualties in emotional terms, his rider's mysterious death leaving him confused and angry. Yet his size and proven battle experience made him an invaluable prize for anyone capable of earning his acceptance. The recruitment process began with ravens sent throughout the Seven Kingdoms, carrying messages that promised royal favor and substantial rewards for any man or woman who could prove Targaryen ancestry, however distant or questionable. The response was overwhelming, with hundreds of claimants arriving at Dragonstone by ship and boat, each carrying family stories and genealogical claims that ranged from plausible to utterly fabricated. Adam of Hull was among the first to answer the call, a young shipwright whose silver hair and violet eyes marked him as almost certainly of royal blood, despite his bastard birth. His resemblance to Rhaenyra Velaryon was so striking that many whispered he might be the late prince's son, though such speculation remained unconfirmed. What mattered was his obvious Targaryen heritage and his natural affinity for the sea, qualities that would prove crucial in his eventual bonding with Seasmoke. His brother Arlen accompanied him to Dragonstone, though the younger Hull possessed darker coloring that suggested a different father or perhaps simple genetic variation. Both brothers had grown up around ships and dragons, their childhood spent watching the great beasts soar over the harbor, while they learned the crafts that sustained their modest household. This familiarity with dragon presence would prove invaluable when they faced the terrifying reality of attempting to claim wild beasts. Hugh Hammer arrived from King's Landing, with claims of descent from King Aegon the Conqueror himself through a bastard line that supposedly traced back to the early days of Targaryen rule. A blacksmith by trade, he possessed the massive build and fearless temperament that marked him as a natural warrior, though his coarse manner and ambitious nature made him a questionable addition to any royal court. His silver-gold hair and purple eyes supported his genealogical claims, while his obvious intelligence suggested he might prove capable of the complex mental bonding required for dragon riding. Ulf White, called Ulf the Sot for his legendary capacity for wine consumption, presented perhaps the most unlikely candidate among the early arrivals. A bastard of Dragonstone itself, he had spent his adult life as a town drunk, whose primary accomplishments involved emptying taverns and starting fights with anyone foolish enough to listen to his boastful claims of royal ancestry. Yet his undeniable Targaryen features and intimate knowledge of dragon behavior, gained from years of observing the beasts while in various states of intoxication, made him an intriguing prospect despite his obvious character flaws. Nettles represented the greatest mystery among the dragon seeds, a young woman of uncertain parentage whose only obvious qualification was her fierce determination to claim a dragon. Despite lacking any visible Targaryen features, her dark skin and brown hair should have disqualified her according to traditional understanding of dragon bonding, yet her eventual success would force a fundamental re-evaluation of the requirements for becoming a dragon rider. The claiming process itself proved far more dangerous than even the most pessimistic observers had predicted, with the volcanic caves beneath Dragonstone becoming a charnel house of failed attempts and gruesome deaths. Dragons, it seemed, were extraordinarily particular about their choice of riders, rejecting most candidates with fatal consequences that ranged from incineration to simple devouring. The first attempts focused on Vermithor, whose size and reputation made him the most prestigious prize available. Dozens of would-be riders approached the Bronze Fury's lair, armed with nothing but courage and questionable genealogies, only to become meals for a dragon who had no patience for pretenders. The ancient beast's method of rejection was typically swift and brutal, with claimants lasting only seconds before meeting their fiery end. Those who survived long enough to flee spoke of the terror in Vermithor's golden eyes, an intelligence that seemed to peer directly into their souls and find them wanting. The dragon's roars echoed throughout the mountain, serving as both warning and funeral dirge for those foolish enough to test his patience. The pile of charred bones outside his cave grew daily, creating a grisly monument to human ambition and draconic intolerance. Hugh Hammer's eventual success in claiming Vermithor came after weeks of careful preparation and observation, the blacksmith spending countless hours studying the dragon's behavior patterns and mood changes. His approach was methodical rather than heroic, treating the bonding process as a craft to be mastered rather than a feat of courage to be attempted. When he finally entered the Bronze Fury's presence, it was with the confident bearing of a man who understood both his own worth and the beast he sought to command. The moment of bonding between Hugh and Vermithor created a partnership that would define much of the war's final phase, though not always in ways that served Queen Rhaenyra's interests. The massive dragon's acceptance of his new rider was grudging rather than enthusiastic, a practical alliance based on mutual respect rather than the deep emotional connection that characterized the most successful dragon rider partnerships. Ulf White's claiming of Silverwing proved equally dramatic but far more bizarre, as the perpetually drunk bastard stumbled into the she-dragon's presence during one of his characteristic benders and somehow emerged not only alive but bonded to one of the realm's most venerable dragons. Witnesses to the event could never adequately explain what had transpired, with most accounts focusing on Ulf's apparent conversation with Silverwing that lasted for hours before she finally accepted him as her rider. The partnership between Ulf and Silverwing was perhaps the strangest in dragon riding history, pairing a magnificent ancient she-dragon with a man whose primary qualifications seemed to be fearlessness and an inexplicable ability to remain conscious despite consuming heroic quantities of alcohol. Yet their bond proved surprisingly effective in battle, with Silverwing's gentle nature complementing Ulf's reckless bravery in ways that made them formidable opponents. Adam of Hull's success with Seasmoke represented a triumph of patience and empathy over force and ambition, as the young shipwright spent weeks simply sitting near the grieving dragon's lair without making any attempt to approach or command. His understanding of loss, gained through his own uncertain parentage and humble circumstances, seemed to resonate with Seasmoke's mourning for his lost Rhaenyra. The eventual bonding between Adam and Seasmoke was gentle rather than dramatic, marked by the dragon's gradual acceptance of human companionship rather than any sudden moment of recognition or submission. Their partnership would prove to be among the most successful of all the dragonseed bondings, combining Adam's natural sailing instincts with Seasmoke's proven battle experience in ways that made them invaluable for naval operations. Nettle's claiming of the wild dragon sheep-stealer in the mountains of the Vale represented perhaps the most remarkable achievement of the entire Dragonseed program, as she succeeded where traditional Targaryen candidates had failed through methods that defied all established understanding of dragon bonding. Her approach was based on feeding rather than commanding, bringing sheep to the dragon's mountain lair day after day until the suspicious beast began to associate her presence with easy meals. The process took months of patient work, with Nettles gradually gaining sheep-stealer's tolerance and eventually his acceptance through sheer persistence and practical intelligence. Her success challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of dragon bonding, suggesting that determination and understanding might matter more than blood purity in earning a dragon's loyalty. The expansion of Rhaenyra's dragon-riding force through the Dragonseed program represented both triumph and potential disaster, as the new riders brought formidable military capabilities, along with questionable loyalties and uncertain temperaments. Hugh Hammer and Ulf White in particular showed signs of ambition that extended beyond simple service to their queen, their newfound power awakening desires for independence and recognition that would prove increasingly problematic. The political implications of legitimizing bastard dragon riders extended far beyond immediate military concerns, as the precedent threatened to undermine the very foundations of Targaryen exclusivity that had sustained their rule for over a century. If dragons would accept riders of questionable or distant royal blood, what made the true-born members of House Targaryen special beyond their political position? The training of the new dragon riders proved almost as challenging as their initial recruitment, as men and women who had spent their lives in humble circumstances struggled to master both the physical and mental aspects of dragon command. Flying required not only courage but also the kind of spatial awareness and tactical thinking that could only be developed through extensive practice. The integration of the dragon seeds into Queen Rhaenyra's war effort created new tensions within her existing command structure, as established nobles found themselves serving alongside former blacksmiths and bastards whose only qualification was their ability to ride dragons. The traditional hierarchy of birth and breeding was turned upside down by the simple reality that dragon riders, regardless of their origins, were too valuable to be dismissed or marginalized. Yet despite these complications, the Dragon Seed program achieved its primary objective of expanding Rhaenyra's aerial capabilities at a crucial moment in the war's development. The sight of multiple dragons bearing the Black Queen's banners sent a powerful message to both supporters and enemies about her determination to claim her rightful throne regardless of the cost. The success of the program also inspired similar efforts among the Greens, though their limited access to unclaimed dragons and smaller pool of potential candidates made their own recruitment far less successful. The disparity in dragon numbers that resulted from Rhaenyra's innovation would prove crucial in subsequent battles, though the loyalty of the new riders would remain questionable throughout the conflict. As winter deepened and both sides prepared for the decisive campaigns of 130 AC, the Dragon Seed program represented both the heights of Targaryen innovation and the seeds of future betrayal that would ultimately contribute to the dynasty's near destruction. The convergence of multiple catastrophes in the summer of 130 AC created the perfect storm that would finally deliver King's Landing into Queen Rhaenyra's hands, though the victory would prove far more costly and pyrrhic than anyone anticipated. The capital that had once seemed impregnable behind its walls and royal dragons found itself increasingly isolated as black forces tightened their grip on both land and sea approaches to the city. The Battle of the Gullet represented perhaps the most crucial naval engagement of the entire war, fought in the narrow waters where Blackwater Bay met the broader expanse of the Narrow Sea. The Triarchy, those Associ merchant princes who had long resented Targaryen interference in their trade routes, had finally committed their substantial fleets to King Aegon's cause in exchange for promises of commercial concessions and territorial grants. The alliance between the Greens and the Free Cities was born of mutual necessity rather than natural affinity, as both sides faced existential threats that required desperate measures to overcome. The Triarchy brought dozens of warships and thousands of experienced sailors to supplement the royal fleet, while King Aegon offered them the prospect of breaking Valyrian dominance over the narrow seas shipping lanes. Prince Jacaerys commanded the Black naval forces with the kind of strategic brilliance that had marked his rapid maturation from teenage heir to seasoned commander. His understanding of both naval tactics and dragon warfare made him ideally suited for the complex battle that was about to unfold, where success would require perfect coordination between ships and flying beasts in conditions that favored neither. The initial phases of the battle proceeded according to Jacaerys' carefully laid plans, with the Valyrian fleet using their superior knowledge of local waters to outmaneuver the larger but less experienced Triarchy forces. Lord Corlys had spent decades perfecting naval tactics that maximized the advantages of speed and maneuverability over raw numbers, and his captains employed these lessons with devastating effectiveness. Yet the presence of dragons on both sides transformed what should have been a conventional naval engagement into something unprecedented in the annals of warfare. Vermax, carrying Prince Jacaerys, led the aerial assault against the enemy fleet with the kind of precision that only came from years of training and natural talent. The young dragon's green and bronze scales flashed like emeralds and copper as he dove repeatedly through the forest of masts and sails below. The Triarchy's response revealed both their desperation and their tactical innovation, as crews armed with scorpions and other siege engines attempted to bring down the black dragons through concentrated volleys of projectiles. The sight of massive crossbow bolts and ballista stones filling the air around diving dragons created a spectacle that witnesses would remember for the remainder of their lives. Jaehaerys's death came not from enemy action, but from the chaotic nature of aerial combat over a crowded battlefield, as Vermax became entangled in the rigging of a sinking Triarchy vessel and was dragged beneath the waves before either dragon or rider could escape. The young prince, who had shown such promise as both military commander and future king, disappeared beneath the green waters of the narrow sea, his body never recovered despite extensive searches. The loss of Queen Rhaenyra's heir and eldest son created a psychological blow that reverberated throughout the Black faction, as supporters who had rallied to the cause of restoring a wronged princess found themselves questioning whether the cost of victory was becoming too high to bear. Jaehaerys had represented not only military leadership but also the future of the dynasty, his death raising uncomfortable questions about the succession after Rhaenyra. The practical consequences of losing Jaehaerys extended beyond simple grief, as his death eliminated one of the few commanders capable of coordinating complex operations involving both traditional forces and dragons. His combination of royal authority, tactical intelligence, and genuine leadership ability had made him irreplaceable in ways that became apparent only after his loss. Yet despite this devastating personal cost, the Battle of the Gullet achieved its strategic objectives, breaking the Triarchy fleet and eliminating the naval threat to Dragonstone, while opening King's Landing to complete blockade by Velaryon forces. The capital's isolation was now complete, with no hope of relief arriving by sea to break the stranglehold that was slowly choking the life from the Green cause. The psychological impact of the naval victory extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, as news of the Triarchy's defeat spread throughout Essos and convinced many foreign observers that Queen Rhaenyra possessed both the will and the capability to achieve ultimate victory. This perception shift led to increased diplomatic recognition and financial support from across the narrow sea. Meanwhile, Prince Daemon's return from Harrenhal brought with him not only the substantial force of riverlords that had gathered to his banners, but also an army of northern soldiers led by Lord Cregan Stark himself. The convergence of these forces created the largest military coalition assembled since Aegon's conquest, with tens of thousands of disciplined soldiers prepared to assault the capital's formidable defenses. The sight of this massive army spreading across the countryside south of King's Landing sent panic through the city's population, as citizens who had endured months of blockade and food shortages now faced the prospect of direct assault by overwhelming numbers. The royal government's attempts to maintain order became increasingly desperate as social fabric began to fray under the pressure of approaching doom. King Aegon's physical condition made effective leadership impossible, as the injuries suffered at Rook's Rest had left him unable to walk without assistance and in constant pain that made concentration difficult. The king, who should have been rallying his supporters for the capital's defense, instead lay bedridden, while others made the crucial decisions that would determine his dynasty's survival. Prince Aemond's assumption of effective authority came too late to reverse the strategic disasters that had accumulated over the preceding months, though his attempts to organize a coherent defense demonstrated the tactical brilliance that made him such a formidable opponent. His control of Vhagar represented the Green's last major military asset, but even the largest dragon in the world could not be everywhere at once. The decision to evacuate King Aegon from the capital reflected both practical necessity and political calculation, as keeping the injured king in a city about to fall would have guaranteed his capture or death. The nighttime flight that carried Aegon and Sunfire away from King's Landing marked the effective end of Green resistance in the capital, though few realized it at the time. The storming of the Dragon Pit represented perhaps the most shocking development in the entire war, as the common people of King's Landing turned their rage against the very symbols of Targaryen power that had dominated their city for over a century. The mob that gathered outside the massive domed structure was driven not by political calculation, but by primal fury against the dragons, whose civil war had brought such suffering to innocent civilians. The destruction that followed was both horrific and irreversible, as thousands of ordinary citizens, armed with little more than farm tools and desperate courage, attacked creatures that could incinerate dozens with a single breath. The courage required for such an assault was matched only by its futility, as the trapped dragons fought with the desperate ferocity of cornered beasts facing extinction. The death of multiple dragons in the Dragon Pit's conflagration marked a turning point not only in the current war, but in the entire history of House Targaryen, as the dynasty lost more of its signature creatures in a single night than in any previous conflict since the doom of Valyria. The sight of the Great Dome collapsing in flames provided a symbol of royal vulnerability that would inspire rebellions for generations to come. Queen Rhaenyra's entry into King's Landing should have been the moment of her greatest triumph, the vindication of decades of struggle and the fulfillment of her father's promise that she would sit upon the Iron Throne. Instead, the queen who rode through the city gates found herself ruling over a capital devastated by war, famine, and the kind of popular uprising that had destroyed dynasties throughout history. The Iron Throne itself seemed to mock her victory, as the jagged seat created from the swords of defeated enemies offered no comfort to the woman who had finally claimed it. The cuts that the throne inflicted upon her hands during the coronation ceremony were interpreted by many as an omen of the difficulties that lay ahead, though Rhaenyra herself dismissed such superstitions with the contempt they deserved. The initial celebrations of Rhaenyra's victory were subdued by the reality of what she had inherited, as the capital bore little resemblance to the prosperous city that her father had ruled. The population was decimated by war and disease, the royal treasury was nearly empty, and the very foundations of royal authority had been shaken by the successful popular revolt against dragon power. The executions that followed Rhaenyra's assumption of power reflected both political necessity and personal vengeance, as supporters of the previous regime faced the kind of purge that typically accompanied dynastic changes. The sight of heads on spikes above the city gates served as a reminder that mercy was often a luxury that victorious queens could not afford. Yet even in victory, the seeds of future disaster were already taking root, as the queen who had fought so hard to claim her throne discovered that ruling was far more difficult than conquering. The dragons that had won her the crown were mostly dead or wounded, while the supporters who had carried her to victory harbored their own ambitions and grievances that would prove increasingly difficult to manage. The transformation of Princess Rhaenyra from Realm's Delight to the harder, more ruthless queen, who now sat upon the Iron Throne, reflected the fundamental changes that war brings to even the most well-intentioned rulers. The woman who had once charmed lords with her beauty and grace now relied on fear and force to maintain order in a realm that seemed determined to tear itself apart. The news of the capital's fall reached the scattered green forces like a funeral bell, confirming what many had already suspected about the hopelessness of their cause. Yet rather than ending the war, Rhaenyra's victory merely transformed it from a struggle for the throne into a more desperate conflict focused on survival and revenge. The queen, who had finally achieved her life's ambition, found herself ruling over ashes, her triumph as hollow as it was hard-won. The Iron Throne was hers at last, but the price of victory had been so high that she might have been better served by never pursuing it at all. The woman who had once been celebrated as the realm's delight transformed into something far darker during her brief and troubled reign from the Iron Throne. Queen Rhaenyra's rule over King's Landing became a study in how power exercised without restraint can corrupt even the most well-intentioned souls, as the gracious princess of earlier years gave way to a monarch whose cruelty would earn her the epithet Mygor with teats among the common people she claimed to serve. The immediate challenges facing the new queen were staggering in both scope and complexity, as she inherited a capital devastated by war, depleted by blockade, and traumatized by the unprecedented popular uprising that had destroyed the Dragon Pit. The city that had once housed nearly 500,000 souls was reduced to perhaps half that number, with refugees, disease, and starvation having taken a terrible toll on the civilian population. The royal treasury's depletion presented perhaps the most pressing crisis, as years of warfare had drained the reserves accumulated during King Viserys' peaceful reign, while simultaneously destroying many of the revenue sources that had sustained royal finances. The cost of maintaining armies, supporting dragons, and conducting a multi-theater war had proven astronomical, while the disruption of trade had eliminated much of the customs revenue that normally filled the crown's coffers. Rhaenyra's solution to these financial difficulties was as predictable as it was brutal, imposing crushing tax burdens on a population already struggling to survive the war's devastation. The queen, who had once promised to rule with justice and mercy, found herself extorting gold from subjects who had barely enough to feed their families, her collectors employing methods that would have shamed Mago the Cruel himself. The persecution of those who had supported King Aegon's regime began with legitimate security concerns, but quickly expanded into something approaching a reign of terror, as the Queen's paranoia about potential threats led to increasingly arbitrary arrests and executions. Families that had served the crown faithfully for generations found themselves branded as traitors for the simple crime of backing the wrong claimant in an impossible choice. The transformation of Queen Rhaenyra's personality during this period was observed with growing alarm by those closest to her, as the stress of ruling during wartime combined with personal grief over her lost sons to create a volatile mixture of rage, suspicion, and cruelty. The woman who had once sought to heal the realm's divisions now seemed determined to deepen them through policies that punished entire regions for their leaders' choices. The attack on the faith of the Seven represented perhaps the most shocking departure from traditional Targaryen policy, as the queen blamed the religious establishment for legitimizing Aegon's usurpation and sought to punish the entire institution for its political stance. Septons who had preached against her rule faced imprisonment or worse, while Sept property was seized to help fund the ongoing war effort. This religious persecution created a new category of opposition to Rhaenyra's rule, as pious smallfolk who might have accepted dynastic change found themselves defending their faith against royal attack. The sight of septons in chains and holy sites being desecrated turned many neutral citizens into active enemies of the Black regime, undermining whatever popular support the queen might have otherwise commanded. The most devastating betrayal of Rhaenyra's reign came not from external enemies but from within her own ranks, as the dragon riders Hugh Hammer and Ulf White revealed the true extent of their ambitions during the chaos that engulfed the town of Tumbleton. The two men whom the queen had elevated from humble origins to positions of unprecedented power proved that gratitude was no guarantee of loyalty when greater opportunities presented themselves. Hugh Hammer's transformation from grateful bastard to would-be king represented the logical extreme of the Dragonseed program's inherent contradictions, as a man with royal blood and a royal dragon saw no reason why he should serve others rather than himself. His claim to descend from Aegon the Conqueror was probably false, but the massive bronze dragon beneath him made such genealogical details irrelevant to those seeking a new master. The declaration of Hugh the Hammer as King Hugh the Frey sent shockwaves through both remaining factions, as it demonstrated that the Dance of Dragons had created opportunities for ambitious men to carve out their own kingdoms from the chaos of civil war. His control of Vermouth made him a formidable threat to both Rhaenyra and the scattered green forces, while his willingness to destroy Tumbleton showed that he possessed the ruthlessness necessary for independent rule. Ulf White's parallel claim to royal authority was less grandiose but equally threatening, as the former drunkard now styled himself Lord of Bitterbridge and began issuing proclamations in his own name rather than the Queen's. His control of Silverwing gave substance to these pretensions, while his knowledge of common-born grievances made him dangerously effective at recruiting supporters from the war-weary population. The sack of Tumbleton became one of the war's most notorious atrocities, as the betrayers allowed their followers to indulge in an orgy of violence and destruction that shocked even hardened veterans of the conflict. The town that had welcomed them as liberators was reduced to ash and bone, its population subjected to horrors that would be remembered in song and story for centuries to come. The manner of Tumbleton's destruction revealed the fundamental breakdown of military discipline that characterized the war's final phase, as commanders lost control of forces that had been brutalized by years of conflict and wanted only to take what they could before the fighting finally ended. The sight of dragon fires consuming innocent civilians while their supposed protectors did nothing to stop the massacre showed how far all sides had fallen from their original noble intentions. Queen Rhaenyra's response to the betrayal was swift but ultimately ineffective, as she lacked the military resources necessary to immediately punish the traitors while simultaneously defending against green counterattacks and maintaining control over King's Landing. The queen, who had once commanded the loyalty of multiple dragons, now found herself with barely enough riders to defend her own capital. The psychological impact of the betrayal extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, as Rhaenyra's remaining supporters began to question whether their own loyalty was misplaced and whether they might be better served by seeking accommodation with one of the competing factions. The bonds of personal allegiance that had sustained the Black cause through its darkest hours were finally beginning to fray under the pressure of repeated disasters. Prince Daemon's reaction to news of the betrayal was characteristically violent, as he demanded immediate retaliation against all dragon seeds regardless of their actual involvement in the treachery. His proposal to execute Aegon Velaryon and Nettles as potential traitors revealed the paranoid thinking that was beginning to infect the Black leadership, while his inability to distinguish between loyal supporters and actual enemies showed how thoroughly the war had corrupted his judgment. The Queen's decision to order the arrest of Aegon Velaryon represented perhaps the greatest strategic error of her entire reign, as it transformed one of her most capable and loyal commanders into a potential enemy while sending a clear message to other supporters about the reliability of royal protection. The young man who had served faithfully throughout the war now faced execution based on nothing more than his association with proven traitors. Aegon's dramatic escape from Dragonstone aboard Seasmoke denied the Queen one of her few remaining experienced dragon riders, while providing her enemies with a powerful symbol of Black tyranny and injustice. The sight of a loyal dragon seed fleeing royal persecution convinced many wavering lords that Rhaenyra's cause had become indistinguishable from the arbitrary despotism she had once opposed. The case of Nettles presented even more complex challenges, as Prince Daemon's obvious affection for the young dragon rider created suspicions about both their relationship and her ultimate loyalties. The Queen's jealousy of a woman who commanded both a dragon and her husband's attention led to increasingly irrational demands for Nettles' arrest or execution, despite the complete absence of evidence linking her to any treacherous activity. The growing paranoia that characterized Rhaenyra's final months on the Iron Throne was fed by genuine threats, but magnified by the accumulated stress of ruling during an increasingly hopeless war. Every messenger brought news of fresh disasters, while every advisor seemed to harbor private agendas that complicated rather than simplified the impossible choices facing the Queen. The economic collapse of King's Landing under Rhaenyra's rule created conditions that made popular uprising almost inevitable, as citizens who had initially welcomed the end of the siege found themselves facing starvation under their supposed liberator. The Queen's tax collectors became more hated than enemy soldiers had ever been, while her arbitrary arrests and executions created a climate of fear that poisoned all social relations. The religious opposition to Rhaenyra's rule, gained strength throughout her brief reign, as common people found in their faith the only remaining source of comfort and community in a world that seemed to have lost all meaning. The sight of royal guards breaking down sept doors and dragging away beloved septons created martyrs whose memory would inspire resistance for years to come. The final months of 130 AC saw Queen Rhaenyra's position deteriorating with accelerating speed, as military defeats combined with internal betrayals and popular unrest to create a perfect storm that would ultimately drive her from the throne she had fought so hard to claim. The queen who had once seemed destined for greatness now found herself ruling over a kingdom that was destroying itself faster than any external enemy could have managed. The irony of Rhaenyra's situation was not lost on those who remembered her father's peaceful reign, as the daughter who had promised to heal the realm's wounds instead inflicted new ones that would take generations to repair. The crown that she had inherited through right of birth had become a burden too heavy for anyone to bear, yet she could not abandon it without admitting that her entire life's struggle had been meaningless. As winter deepened and her enemies closed in from all directions, Queen Rhaenyra faced the terrible reality that victory in civil war was often indistinguishable from defeat, especially when the price of winning had been the destruction of everything worth ruling. The Iron Throne was hers, but the kingdom it commanded was rapidly becoming nothing more than ash and memory. The confrontation that would end the Dance of Dragons began not with royal proclamations or military strategies, but with the deep personal hatred that had festered between uncle and nephew for over a decade. Prince Daemon Targaryen and Prince Aemond One-Eye had been circling each other like predators throughout the war, their mutual animosity transcending the political causes that had originally divided their factions. Now, as the conflict entered its final and most desperate phase, they would meet above the cursed waters of the God's Eye to settle their blood feud with fire and steel. The lake that would witness their final battle had been considered sacred since the dawn of recorded history, its dark waters reflecting not only the sky above, but also the mysteries of forgotten ages. Ancient legends spoke of the green men who dwelt upon the Isle of Faces at the lake's heart, the last followers of the old gods south of the Neck, who had witnessed the coming of the first men and the subsequent rise and fall of countless kingdoms. Prince Daemon's journey to this fateful encounter was haunted by the visions that had plagued him throughout his residence at Harrenhal, dreams of dragons falling from burning skies and kings crowned in ash and bone. Alice Rivers, the witch who had become his companion and perhaps his lover, spoke in riddles about destiny and sacrifice, her words carrying the weight of prophecy, though their meaning remained frustratingly unclear. The decision to face Aemond in single combat represented either supreme confidence in his abilities or a death wish born from the accumulated weight of grief and guilt that had marked Daemon's later years. The prince who had once been called the Rogue Dragon had lost his stepson Lucerys to Aemond's cruelty, watched his wife transform from beloved queen to despised tyrant, and seen his dreams of Targaryen glory dissolve into nightmare. Caraxes, the bloodworm who had carried Daemon through countless battles, seemed to sense the finality of their approaching encounter, the great red dragon displaying an unusual restlessness that even his experienced rider found disturbing. The serpentine beast had been Daemon's constant companion for decades, their bond forged in the fires of war and strengthened through shared victories and defeats that had made them legendary throughout the known world. Prince Aemond's approach to the God's Eye was marked by the same cold calculation that had characterized his entire military career, his control over the massive Vhagar absolute, despite the ancient dragon's temperamental nature. The largest dragon in the world had been his weapon of choice since claiming her as a boy, their partnership built on mutual respect for each other's capacity for violence and destruction. The sight of Vhagar's shadow falling across the lake's surface must have seemed like an omen to any who witnessed it. The ancient she-dragon's massive wingspan capable of blocking out the sun itself when she flew low enough. Her pale green scales, scarred by centuries of battles dating back to the conquest itself, marked her as a living piece of history whose death would represent the end of an era. The initial moments of their encounter were marked by the formal courtesies that tradition demanded even in mortal combat, as uncle and nephew exchanged words whose content history has not preserved, but whose tone was certainly venomous. Whatever was said between them served only to confirm what both had long known, that their hatred had grown too deep for any resolution save death. The aerial battle that followed was unlike anything witnessed in the entire history of dragon warfare, as two of the most experienced dragon riders in Westeros commanded beasts whose combined age exceeded 2 centuries. Carax's speed and agility allowed him to dart around Vhagar's massive bulk like a striking serpent, while the larger dragon's sheer size and power made every successful attack potentially decisive. The tactics employed by both riders reflected their intimate knowledge of each other's strengths and weaknesses, gained through years of shared training and mutual observation during their youth at court. Daemon's aggressive style of combat, favored throughout his career, met its match in Aemond's patient approach that sought to use Vhagar's advantages while minimizing her vulnerabilities. The battle raged for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, as the two dragons tore at each other with the desperate fury of beasts that understood their own mortality. The sound of their roars echoed across the lake and surrounding countryside, a draconic death song that would haunt the nightmares of survivors for the remainder of their lives. Witnesses to the battle, watching from the shores of the God's Eye, reported that both dragons were grievously wounded before the encounter's climactic moment, their blood falling like crimson rain into the dark waters below. Carax's natural agility was compromised by injuries to his wings, while Vhagar's massive size became a liability as her strength ebbed from multiple wounds. The final moments of the battle saw Daemon employ the kind of desperate tactic that had made him legendary throughout his military career, as he unbound himself from Carax's saddle and leaped onto Vhagar's massive neck with Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel sword of Aegon the Conqueror, in his hand. The sight of the rogue dragon attempting to fight a battle on Dragonback without the safety of restraints must have seemed like madness to any who witnessed it. Yet madness and genius often appear identical in their execution, as Daemon's suicidal gambit allowed him to drive his ancestral blade through Aemond's remaining eye and deep into the young prince's skull. The impact of Valyrian steel meeting bone created a sound that cut through even the chaos of dragon combat, marking the moment when the most dangerous Green Commander finally met his match. Hasseman's death did not end the battle, but rather transformed it into something even more terrible, as the dying prince's weight caused him to fall forward onto Vhagar's neck, while his lifeless hands remained tangled in her reins. The ancient dragon, mortally wounded and maddened by pain, lost all semblance of controlled flight as she plummeted toward the lake's surface with both princes still upon her back. The impact when 3 creatures weighing several tons each struck the water created a splash that was visible from miles away, while the steam that rose from their combined body heat meeting the lake's cold depths obscured the scene for crucial minutes. When the mist finally cleared, nothing remained visible above the surface save ripples that gradually expanded toward the distant shores. The deaths of both Daemon and Aemond in the space of a few terrible minutes eliminated the 2 most capable military commanders remaining to either faction, leaving both sides leaderless at the precise moment when decisive action was most desperately needed. The men who had been the driving forces behind much of the war's violence had finally destroyed each other, but their mutual annihilation brought no peace to the bleeding realm. The recovery of the bodies took months of searching by divers who braved the lake's supernatural reputation in pursuit of royal rewards, though what they eventually brought to the surface bore little resemblance to the proud princes who had once commanded dragons and armies. Dark Sister was found still clutched in Daemon's skeletal hand, the blade's Valyrian steel unmarked by its time beneath the waters. The political consequences of the God's Eye battle reverberated throughout both factions as commanders and advisors struggled to adapt their strategies to the sudden absence of their most experienced leaders. Prince Daemon's death deprived Queen Rhaenyra of her strongest supporter and most capable general, while Prince Aemon's loss eliminated the Green's most effective military asset. Meanwhile, the Second Battle of Tumbleton demonstrated that the war's capacity for horror had not been exhausted by the deaths of its primary antagonists, as the forces commanded by the treacherous dragon riders Hugh Hammer and Ulf White clashed with loyalist armies in a conflict that reduced the already devastated town to ash and memory. The battle's outcome was as chaotic as its conduct, with multiple dragon deaths and no clear victor emerging from the carnage. Hugh Hammer's death in the fighting eliminated one of the self-proclaimed kings who had complicated the succession crisis, while Ulf White's survival ensured that at least one usurper remained to threaten whatever government eventually emerged from the war's ruins. The continuing destruction of dragons throughout these final battles was pushing the species toward extinction with terrifying speed, as beasts that had taken decades to mature were being slaughtered in conflicts that lasted only hours. The magnificent creatures that had once numbered in the dozens were being reduced to a handful of survivors whose own futures remained desperately uncertain. Queen Rhaenyra's position in King's Landing became increasingly untenable as news of these disasters reached the capital, while popular unrest continued to grow among citizens who blamed her rule for the ongoing catastrophes that seemed to multiply with each passing week. The queen who had once been the realm's delight now found herself reviled by the very people she claimed to serve. The final irony of Rhaenyra's reign came when King Aegon recovered enough from his injuries to mount Sunfire despite his continued pain, returned to reclaim his capital from the half-sister who had usurped his throne. The broken king and his wounded dragon represented the last remnants of green military power, yet they proved sufficient to drive the Black Queen from the seat she had fought so hard to claim. Rhaenyra's flight from King's Landing marked the effective end of her reign and the beginning of her final desperate attempt to salvage something from the ruins of her cause. The woman who had once commanded multiple dragons and the loyalty of half the realm now found herself reduced to the status of a fugitive seeking sanctuary wherever it might be found. Her return to Dragonstone should have provided safety and an opportunity to rebuild her shattered forces, but the ancient fortress that had been her birthright became instead the site of her final tragedy. The Dragon Queen who had spent her life fighting for recognition and respect would find neither in the end, only the bitter taste of defeat and the cold comfort of an empty throne. The capture and execution of Queen Rhaenyra by her half-brother represented not the war's end, but simply another turn in a cycle of violence that had consumed an entire generation of Targaryens. Her death before Sunfire's jaws provided a grotesque finale to a conflict that had begun with questions of legitimacy and ended with simple murder. The aftermath of the Dance of Dragons left Westeros fundamentally changed, with the Targaryen dynasty reduced to a shadow of its former power, and the dragons that had once been their greatest strength nearly extinct. The realm that emerged from the conflict bore little resemblance to the prosperous kingdom that King Viserys had ruled, as civil war had destroyed not only lives and property, but also the very foundations of royal authority. Young Aegon III, traumatized by witnessing his mother's death and inheriting a crown that had cost his family everything worth having, would spend his reign trying to heal wounds that might never fully close. The boy king's melancholy and hatred of dragons reflected the broader damage that the civil war had inflicted upon the Targaryen psyche. The Hour of the Wolf, Lord Cregan Stark's brief period of dominance in King's Landing, provided a stark reminder that royal blood meant nothing without the power to enforce royal will. The Northern Lord's dispensation of justice, including the poisoning of the crippled King Aegon II, demonstrated that even the mightiest dynasties were subject to the judgment of men who valued honor above politics. The Dance of Dragons had answered the question of whether the Seven Kingdoms were ready for a queen, but the answer was written in ash and blood across a devastated landscape. Neither faction had truly won, for victory in such a conflict was measured not in crowns claimed, but in the cost of claiming them. The legacy of the war would shape Targaryen rule for generations to come, as future kings and queens struggled with the knowledge that their greatest enemies were often found within their own family. The dragons that had once made them gods among men were gone, leaving only the Iron Throne and the bitter memories of what ambition and pride could cost those who pursued them without limit. The realm would eventually heal, as realms always do, but the scars left by the Dance of Dragons would remain visible for centuries to come. In the end, the war had proven that even dragons could be mortal, even kingdoms could bleed, and even the mightiest dynasties could destroy themselves through the simple human failings of hatred, pride, and the refusal to compromise, when compromise was the only path to survival.